Some discoveries rewrite a footnote. These ones, however, will rewrite the entire historical timeline. Archaeologists in Iraq pulled a clay tablet from a trench expecting accounting records. Instead, what they found should not exist. The tablet contained knowledge that history insists is impossible. First, they found instructions for building a device that behaves like a modern battery. A few miles away, another team uncovered a star map carved with impossible precision, one that matches the sky as it looked 10,000 years before Sumer even existed. And beneath both of those layers, buried under flood debris, researchers found a list of rulers whose combined reigns stretch over 241,000 years. None of this should exist, none of it fits, and yet all of it comes from the same civilization we're told was the beginning of human history. Sumer appears suddenly fully formed, writing, mathematics, law, irrigation engineering, architecture, astronomy, all arriving at once, like someone handed humanity a completed blueprint. Their earliest myths describe objects of knowledge called the me. Not metaphors, not ideals, but physical items that cannot be destroyed, only hidden, capable of granting entire sciences or technologies to whoever possessed them. Their gods arrive with tools that cut stone without breaking, shining craft that descend on pillars of fire, and measuring devices that reveal what the eye cannot see. And deeper still, there's the part we're not supposed to ask about. The part where Sumerian texts claim they were not the first people, only the first to rise after a world-ending catastrophe. The part where their earliest kings say they were given the knowledge of a lost age, a world wiped clean by flood, fire and darkness long before history was allowed to start again. But first, before we begin, if you find yourself genuinely pulled towards stories of mystery, conspiracy and forgotten lore, please consider subscribing. And if you truly like tonight's story, a gentle press on the new hype button or a friendly comment sure does go a long way to keep these journeys coming. And now, with that said, let's step inside tonight's story with the discovery of the first tablet. The tablet is heavier than it looks. When it turns, the light catches carved bands that behave like diagrams. A coil sits inside a sketch of a jar, marked by increments that place a copper strip next to something hinted as acid from grapes. The lettering is tight and regular, no wavering mid-stroke, no guesswork. A graduate student reads out symbols under her breath, the way you might count while tying knots. Another worker traces a sequence of wooden staves, a plug, a lid, and a rod that dips into liquid. No one says the word. They don't need to. The drawing carries a familiar shape to a modern eye. It reads like a recipe, but not for bread. Chemical notes sit along the rim, listing mixtures that bite the tongue when spoken aloud. There are proportions that imply voltage, fractions repeated across several lines, as if warning the reader not to overfill. The clay shows two metals, not named as we would say them, but clearly different, paired like opposites in a circuit. Some whisper that these are the principles of a galvanic cell, the heart of a battery. Others dismiss it as an elaborate metaphor. Yet the tablet keeps refusing to turn poetic. It stays mechanical and plain, with lines that close cleanly, like a blueprint. Coil specifications march along a column, the spacing of turns, the thickness of wire. A final mark that states the potential between plates in a way that blends math with craft. Count this many turns to reach this strength. We find modern lab notes echoing the same rhythm. This is the kind of detail that usually takes long trial and error. On clay, though, it arrives complete, like a finished method copied from a bench that no longer exists. Then the edges bend the mind further. In the margin, a handful of numbers sit beside a star-like glyph and a wedge that always means north. They are not random. A quiet technician in the tent rigs a laptop and enters the values, converting the counts into degrees and offsets. He presses return and leans back. The plotted coordinates point to a sky that doesn't match the one overhead. Reverse the math again, dial the clock back, not centuries but deep time, and the pattern settles into place 10 millennia before Sumer appears in the textbooks. Precession does that. The slow wobble of Earth's axis. If the numbers are truly astronomical, the author was mapping not the sky they saw, but the sky someone told them about from a far older horizon. The trench crew folds around the find like an eclipse. Translation trickles in as a team compares signs against a handheld list. These cuneiform strokes are not tentative grammar clicks together, instructive and direct, as if written for an apprentice. No baby steps, no stray experiments. The script is already a tool used by people who expect it to work. By sunset, a courier carries the tablet to a small museum room that smells like linen and old glue. Catalogue slips rustle. A curator hums as she draws a box number in pencil and crosses it out again. The artifact acquires a new tag, and then, for reasons not fully explained, another. In the weeks that follow, the entry changes shelves in the database twice. A translator is asked to provide a summary rather than a full line-by-line. Supporters suggest it's normal backlog chaos. Critics counter that messy shelves always seem to tidy themselves when nothing controversial is inside the crate. Word seeps out anyway, not in journals, but in the soft ring of evening talks and private emails. Someone mentions a second tablet from a nearby layer with a lens diagram. Ground quartz described in steps that produce a curvature fit for focusing light. Another says the coil notes match the spacing on a copper strip found in an adjacent pit. None of these claims land on a press release. They ride whisper networks inside offices where cardboard boxes line the walls. You've heard the global echoes before. Polished stone in Egypt cut so smooth it reflects. Indus Valley copper so pure it surprises modern metallurgy labs. Neolithic Europe turning rock crystal into clear lenses that magnify without distortion. Each anomaly, standing alone, can be chalked up to patience and skill. Set them beside a tablet that lays out coil turns and acid ratios, and the room tilts. The writing itself refuses to act young. The strokes hold grammar like a scaffold. The verbs guide hands, the nouns label parts. There's a tone to it. They calm of a teacher who expects the student to follow complex steps in order. Where other early scripts doodle toward meaning, this one measures and instructs. The message shows no stutter. It feels learned, not invented. In the grain of the clay, you can almost see the scribe pausing to check an older sheet, then resuming, making no corrections because the method is already settled. Think about that scribe. A lamp nearby, soot rising in a thin thread. A reed stylus pressing and lifting, laying down knowledge they did not discover last week. They likely trained in a house that trained others before them. The words imply a chain. If you broke it anywhere along the line, the instructions would slide into error, they don't, which hints at maintenance, a tradition keeping its tools sharp through a long dark. In the following days, a second reading session adds a line everyone missed. The scribal colophon, the little sign-off, mentions a phrase common to Sumerian myth, the great ones who came before the waters. It appears 3 times, almost like a citation. A thing is built as held by the great ones. A measurement is as counted by the great ones. And more curious, a star coordinate is, as the great ones recorded it before the waters. This is not flowery language, it is attribution. A nod to a source older than the scribe city, older than the flood that ends the first chapter of their story. Now the museum hiccups. The object's number in the catalogue shifts digits again. An intern is told not to check that box today. The conservator is reviewing it for stability. Meanwhile, a quiet meeting at a nearby university floats a theory. The tablet is a later copy of an even older set of notes. The tight, mature script fits that. If they were copying something ancient, the language would be clean, as the genre demands. Engineers leave little room for poetry when a wrong mark means a failed result. Elsewhere, in a lab across town, a small experiment unfolds. Using the tablet's ratios and coil instructions, a classic clay jar is assembled with 2 metals, the version implied by the signs the liquid is mixed as the text suggests, pressed through linen and poured. After an hour, a needle moves on a meter. Not much, but it moves. The old notes produce a modern twitch, like a whisper reaching across time. This is where the paradox deepens. A single artifact can be misread, a single test can be luck. But the tablet doesn't stand alone on the shelf. The same region yields star tracks with mathematical regularity woven into their numbers. Their calendar aligns with the dance of Venus and Jupiter in ways that hint at a longer library behind the wall. We aren't at proof, we are at pattern. Widen the view again. In Egypt, techniques for finishing diorite, harder than iron, show drill marks that spiral with a consistency our modern eyes measure and nod at. In the Indus Valley, smelting leaves behind signatures that look like industrial control. In Europe, rough camps hide lenses that wouldn't shame a careful hobbyist today. Supporters suggest these are surviving sparks from a world that burned, kept alive by guilds who never stopped practicing even when their cities fell. Others dismiss the link as romance. But romance doesn't teach voltage limits in a script that can still guide a hand. The more you read of the tablet's plain voice, the more cuneiform itself becomes the stranger. It shows up ready to file taxes and record star paths, to medicate a wound and measure a canal. It's not gibberish that later grows into grammar. It is grammar. It is policy. It is instruction. People don't wake up one morning and invent a full technical language from scratch. They inherit it, or they adapt it from something they knew before a break. One line on the back face hooks the breath. It resembles a coordinate, then veers. The sign after the numbers isn't a star marker, it's a city sign that city sits under flood deposit. Beneath that, still deeper, earlier foundations peek through the sand. If this tablet points to a site older than the city itself, it is not bragging. It is giving directions, like a note folded into a tool chest. It's fair to ask, could scribes have imagined all this? Critics counter that human minds are good at backfilling patterns, that we see technique where there is ritual. It's a healthy caution. But the clay does not reward easy dismissal. It names measures, not metaphors. It pairs metal with liquid in volumes that produce a predictable effect. It pegs star positions to an ancient sky, and those numbers land cleanly when the clock is spun backward a very long way. A senior translator, quiet by nature, closes his notebook after a late session and says nothing to the room. He places a slip of paper into the tablet's folder that reads, in careful script, "Restoration of what was before." He doesn't cite a passage. He notes a feeling of genre restoration, not invention. That word has weight in this field. It's how professionals talk when they see systems appear with no clumsy rehearse. This is the point when speculation becomes difficult to avoid, even if we walk softly. Supporters suggest that Sumer inherited a cache, tablets, diagrams, perhaps even artifacts, from an older culture that talked through objects. The find in our trench reads like one piece of that cache. If you accept that, the rest of the city's early perfection begins to make sense. Irrigation that lines up to a ruler. Bricks that measure true across miles. A calendar that keeps pace with planets as if the count started long ago. You can almost hear the scribe's teacher say, "Copy exactly, do not change the numbers, do not move the lines." That tone haunts preservation work. It is the voice of someone who survived a loss and will not risk garbling the message. Follow the steps, pass the torch. Don't pretend you know why every part fits, just keep the pattern alive. In the weakest light of evening, the connection clicks into place for those who know the old tales. The phrase, "the great ones who came before the waters," repeats in myth as a scattered echo. On this clay, it feels like a signature line. Not a sermon, a credit. Some whisper that these great ones might not be gods at all in the supernatural sense, but survivors with tools and memories, living long enough to seed a restart. Others dismiss this as dressing myth in modern clothes. The tablet doesn't settle the debate, it simply points, steady as a measuring rope pulled taut. The pattern tilts in the dusk and its meaning sharpens. If a plain, practical set of instructions can carry sky positions from 10,000 years earlier, then someone was copying from an archive we do not see, and if those copies name the keepers of the old world before the waters, the next names we meet will not be distant sky thunder. They will be the ones who wore belts with tools and spoke in the voice of farmers and engineers, Enki, Enlil and the Anunnaki, stepping out of myth and into survival work, carrying fragments that would teach a ruined land how to build again. The clay is cool against your palms. A thin film of dust lifts as you tilt the tablet toward the lamplight, and the wedge marks catch a soft glow. The surface is crowded, neat lines, no wasted space, and phrases that land like instructions. Tools worn at the waist, boats that descend on pillars of fire. You breathe out, slow, because the words don't read like prayers. They read like someone trying to explain a machine using a vocabulary built for reeds and river mud. Across the room, a scribe's stylus sits in a dish. You drag a fingertip along the tablet's edge and feel a nick where someone once corrected a line. The text leans into detail. How the visitors sealed water gates. How they divided fields. How they measured soil with a cord stretched tight until it sang no distant thunder, no glowing halos. Just people arriving with gear, living among farmers who still counted by handfuls and watched the sky for rain. Now the tension under the language shows. These early accounts do not praise unreachable skylords. They describe figures who eat, sleep and argue. They stand in the irrigation ditch with rolled hems and bare feet, and they talk about flood timing using terms that sound like centuries of practice. Their presence feels local, startlingly physical, more foreman than phantom. Some whisper the writers were trying to make sense of tools they'd never seen, so they reach for the nearest words, and the nearest words happen to belong to myth. Enki steps forward in these lines not as a miracle worker but as a keeper. His domain is the Abzu, the deep waters, yet he moves like a steward who knows where the records are kept. He stored the wisdom of the old world, the text says, and in other places he warns of a rising sea with measurements, not omens. The style is dry, almost bureaucratic. It reads like an eyewitness who stayed calm when the river rose faster than memory allowed, telling a craftsman to fetch more bitumen, to tie a better knot, to keep a ledger so nothing is lost. Enlil arrives with a different weight. Same stage, harsher light. He enforces order and the words around him stiffen. He does not come across as cruel. He comes across as someone convinced that handing out everything at once would break the students and the school. The reset he orders is not framed as rage. It feels like a controlled burn in a forest, the slash that keeps the fire from taking the whole valley. Supporters suggest these two figures reflect a split among survivors, one pushing to share, the other holding back until humans could carry the load. The name Anunnaki drifts through the text as a category rather than a club. Those who came down from above, the older phrasing goes, and above could mean sky, but it can also mean uplands, high terraces, mountain outposts that outlasted the floodline. Others dismissed the literal descent and read it as status, the elevated seats in a council of elders. The word stretches between heaven and hilltop and refuses to lie flat. That ambiguity leaves room for a grounded reading that still carries a cosmic echo. A handful of smaller tales line the margins like field notes. One lines up the black-headed people along a canal while strangers demonstrate how to slope the bank so water flows without tearing the soil. Another introduces someone who arrives with the measuring rope and a tablet of destinies, a phrase that sounds grand until you read the next sentence, which explains how to lay out a city block. A third story records a visit to a granary, where the stranger insists on standardizing weights, then stays long enough to watch the first season of harvest and correct the scale by a fraction of a shekel. Royal lines in these records read less like sermons and more like resumes. Kings do not simply claim the favour of distant gods. They argue they were trained by them, genealogies linked to named instructors, as if a palace school once kept a roster. The tone is political. rights derived from apprenticeship, not from Thunder Critic's counter, that the style is propaganda dressed as lineage. Maybe. But the dry tone lands strangely if we aim for pure myth. It sounds like minutes from an old meeting. Let the frame widen. The controversial tablet from before hinted at techniques out of time. Set that beside these accounts, and a thread appears. If the tablet holds instructions inherited from an earlier world, the beings teaching from it were guardians more than inventors. They could pass on procedures, but not the whole toolbox. They taught what they had carried in their heads and in a small bundle of objects, and they held back what needed labs and long supply chains that no longer existed. You can hear the clash in the subtext. Enki pockets notebooks and whispers to a boat builder through reeds, while Enlil audits the plan and cancels modules he deems too risky. No lasers here, no glowing suits. Just a push and pull over which parts of a broken archive to revive when the ground is still soft with silt. The argument tracks with human instinct. Share enough to rebuild. Keep back what might melt the rebuild before it cures. The word Anunnaki, in some lists, expands and contracts depending on the job at hand. Sometimes a council, sometimes a set of judges, sometimes a work crew with a foreman. In all cases, the function matters as much as the title. Supporters suggest the winged figures in later art mark capability, not divinity. Movement across distances, control of height, quick arrival and exit. Whether from mountain stations or from craft that left scorch marks, the message to a Bronze Age eye would read the same. They came down from above. Consider a short story from a rural shrine. A woman recounts how a stranger taught her to twist fibres in a specific direction, so rope holds tighter in rain. That's not thunderbolt stuff. That's small, precise craft. Another fragment chipped along the edge says a man arrived with a case of seals, stamped fields with a new emblem, and explained that from now on grain moved in numbered lots. You can almost see the look on a farmer's face, both annoyed and relieved. Order feels heavy the day it arrives. Then it starts to keep things alive. The genealogies return here with an edge. A royal steward lists training stations alongside ancestors, tracing not just blood but classrooms and workshops. Cities rise on that kind of record keeping. They also freeze under it. When a title becomes a birthright, the skill can fade while the name remains. The tablets do not say that. But you can feel it in the way later scribes copy the earlier hands with more reverence than mastery, arguing over tiny curls that once recorded practical steps. Now, back to the tablet in your hands. The phrases about tools worn at the waist include a list: a cutter, a scribe stick, a fastener with teeth. They hang from a belt like a carpenter's kit. The boats that descend on pillars of fire share lines with warnings about wind and heat, and an aside about not storing reed mats near the landing field. It reads mundane. Almost funny if the stakes were not so large. If these were myths, they are the least poetic ones on the shelf. Others dismiss the flood talk as literary scenery. But here, in these cooler passages, the flood is logistics. Enki's warning runs through timber sizes, pitch mixing, grain storage, and a head count of workers. He factors in animals as inventory and clocks the river with a calendar that predates the city he's speaking in. The care in the lines does not drift. It stays tight because the water is coming. That tone, the note of a person who has seen a thing before, pulls the story out of dream and into practice. Enlil, when he enters the floodlines, orders quiet. Fewer signals, less noise. The decree is to slow down the experiments that could spark panic or worse. Not a villain speech, a risk memo. The text respects him even as it bristles. The way a builder respects an inspector who slaps a red tag on a brace that will hold today but fail next spring. If two survivor factions existed, their clash would look like this. Fix the roof now, or redraw the plans before another storm makes the same hole. The word Anunnaki keeps its double charge. It points upward to so-called celestial order, and downward to the people who carry that order into the mud. In some lines, they sit as a council and vote. In others, they haul a beam. The flexible use suggests a role that shifts as a community's needs change flood season. More judges, planting season, more foremen. Each time the above is the principles they claim to guard. The literal height depends on the year. A few scenes breathe like memories. A boy in a river town is taught to trace a right angle by folding a chord into a triangle, with sides in a set ratio. He does not know the theorem, but he knows the trick. A trader learns to test metal by its ring rather than its colour. A potter hears that a vent must face a certain wind or the glaze will fog. None of this calls for magic. All of it feels like knowledge that survived on purpose. The tablet's presence in a temple library tells its own story. Shelved near hymns and tax lists, it sits with the work of daily life, not in a vault of wonders that placement implies use. Priests may chant the lines now, but someone earlier probably read them with dirty hands. A belt tool leaves a scratch on a line that complains about belt tools. It's a small loop, but it hints at a city rehabbing a manual that once belonged to another shop entirely. If gods are survivors, this timeline tilts. Sumer stops being a spark from nothing and becomes the first bright node after a long blackout. The myths turn into case files wrapped in story, the better to carry them through bad weather. The quarrels between Enki and Enlil read like meeting notes from late nights no one wants to relive. The term Anunnaki becomes a job description you can inherit, and a warning label you should not ignore. The pattern seen this way explains why certain skills appear polished at the start. Irrigation that runs like a veteran system on day one brick, sizes that lock into place across cities, star lists that skip the messy trial phase and arrive in full. If fragments of an older archive reached a few careful hands, then the smoothness makes sense. You don't reinvent a knot if you still have the cord. You set the tablet down, half aware of the soft grit that clings to your fingertips. The air feels cooler now. The room's hum pulls back to the edge. There is one last note scrawled in a margin, hard to see unless you tilt the clay just right. It refers to the great ones who came before the waters, not as distant makers, but as keepers of gear, rules and maps worth saving when the doors blew in. If they carried fragments, then what came next could follow a plan. And if a plan survived the flood, then the next section of our story has to ask how a city can appear complete on its first breath, as if someone hit restart and the program loaded with memories intact. The first spade hits damp soil and brings up not broken huts, not trial and error pots, but bricks that match each other like they came from a single mould. You can run your thumb along the edge and feel the clean shoulder of a standard. Lines incised into clay show canal widths, sluice angles, and gate depths, as if someone printed a handbook for running water through a city before the city even stood. The air smells of baked earth and lantern oil. A reed mat crackles underfoot. In most places, the ground keeps the story of failure first and success later. Here, the groundwork begins at mastery. Let the frame widen and you notice how odd the absence feels. Early levels in other lands carry wobbling walls and pencils of script trying to learn their own shapes. Here the writing starts like a clerk who never wavered. Columns, totals, rations, shipments, star times, temple inventories, laid out in a format that already knows what rows and margins are for critics counter that gaps in the record can trick us, that we simply haven't found the messier years. Maybe. Yet the layers exposed so far carry finished systems where we expect drafts and scratched out lines. Hold Egypt in one palm and ancient Greece in the other. Hieroglyphs climb from simple figures to a flowering of signs across centuries. Greek pottery walks a long road from stubby cups to red figure grace. By contrast, the earlier Sumerian tablets arrive fluent. Grammar appears with clear case endings, numbers behave. Fractions, weights, and professional titles settle into place with the confidence of long use. Others dismiss this as the bias of what survived. But even with loss, you would expect a few clumsy steps somewhere on the staircase. Here, the staircase looks installed, not built rung by rung. Listen to the count behind it all, 60. 60 as the clock of the city, 60 as the circle's quiet law. Base 60 doesn't creep in through a series of clunky ledgers, it shows up running. You can feel it in how they divide fields, how they measure canals, how they time the sky. Our hours and minutes still echo that choice. Supporters suggest a borrowed arithmetic, honed before the flood stories, carried down like a tuning fork that never lost its pitch. Maybe those first scribes didn't invent the scale, they kept it in tune. Now step into Eridu at dusk, the heat lets go. A long straight canal throws back a thin strip of light. The banks line up neat, not organic, as if laid from a plan on a table. Blocks fall into rectangles that read like a city grid, not a village that grew wherever people found dry ground. Walk north to Uruk and the pattern repeats at a larger scale. Temple bases rise on terraces with even edges. The alignment suggests someone watched the sky, then pinned stone to the rhythm. You look for the false starts, the crooked ditch, the lopsided foundation, and find instead a consistency that hints at instruction. Inside a small room, a young scribe leans over wet clay. The lamp eats oxygen and gives a soft hiss. He sets star positions with a stylus and never scratches out a line, no smudges. No arithmetic that wobbles. It reads like copying from a chart nearby or a memory trained by repetition. He isn't discovering, he's maintaining. That difference matters. In that room you can feel how a culture behaves when it protects a method rather than invents one on the fly. Across the river, furnaces exhale. Early bronze shows uniform content in cities spaced far apart. The metal doesn't swing wildly from batch to batch. It holds to a recipe weights seem to match. Measures travel. Masons seat bricks with a cadence you can hear in the tap of a setting tool. Same distance, same mortar thickness. Neighbourhood to neighbourhood. Some whisper, this looks like a guild inherited from somewhere older, not a cluster of towns learning by painful error. The archaeological record may be patchy, but standardization across distance feels like a message. On a cylinder seal, a worker pulls a saw with teeth that make sense. A hand drill sits beside bellows that feed steady air. You can almost hear the skin of the bellows wrinkle and inflate, smell the charcoal. The recovered toolkits are humble, yet the results, tight seams in brick, consistent casting, suggest technique beyond the tool's simplicity. Supporters suggest that what you don't see is the manual that taught the hand how to move. The myths walk by quietly and leave a detail on the table. Crafts delivered in baskets, priests guarding tablets of the old world. The phrasing in the research hints at preservation rather than inspiration, like someone ferrying instructions one city at a time through bad weather. Critics counter that poetic language often pretends to be literal. That's fair. But pair the story with this ground. Finished systems, matched measures, sky-aware foundations, and the tale feels less like a metaphor and more like logistics. What does a civilization look like when it returns instead of starts? It looks like this. Irrigation plans laid on an empty plain before the field is planted, streets that know where they're going, administrative clay that assumes everyone understands the forms, no field notes that say, "We tried this, it failed." Just the version that works, stamped and restamped until the pattern holds, the pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens. Someone pressed play. Your hand lands on a tablet that isn't a story but a table. Grain in, beer out. Rations per worker. Yields per canal mile. Underneath, a small line counts days by a method that matches the base 60 heartbeat above. A mark ties the tally to a ritual date keyed to the sky. The economy, the calendar, and the temple turn on the same axle. Others dismiss this as hindsight, as if we arrange neat circles where none existed. Then another tablet appears with the same linkage, and another. Uruk's wall stretches and returns on itself. 6 miles is a lot of stone to place without a warm-up wall in a smaller town somewhere nearby. The record doesn't show the practice wall, it shows the commitment. When the first lift of brick cures, the next foundations are already levelled. That speed tells you something. Either an unseen chain of attempts lies forever buried, or the builders worked from a recipe they trusted on day one. Think of the base 60 system as a habit you learn in childhood. You count that way without thinking, and you see the sky in those fractions because that's how you were taught to see. If the habit came from an older community that timed storms or tracked a long cycle, those students would pass it along intact. Generations later, the numbers still bind the hours and the heavens. The method outlives the teachers. Across this landscape, the early cities echo each other. Canals keep their width, brick sizes match, fractions repeat in ration lists from towns separated by days of walking. This is not the ragged edge of invention. This feels like distribution. It hints at carriers, people, words, rituals, a bundle of practices. The myths give them names and stories. The ground gives them grids and measures. You don't hear the sound of tentative chisels here. You hear the cadence of a crew that knows the count. 3 measures of clay, stack and cut. 2 hands' width of mortar. Check and set, a foreman calls the beat, and the wall rises true. The city breathes in that rhythm. The library grows in that rhythm, line by line, not stretching for language but using it. There's calm in the competence. Some whisper that flood memories sit under all of this like silt. That people who watched water erase their towns learned the value of standards when they started again. Keep the brick size. Keep the measuring rope. Keep the calendar that tells you when to open the gates. If that's the inheritance, it explains the lack of visible prototypes. You prototype when you can afford failure. You standardize when failure kills. In the temple store, a basket sits under a cloth. Inside, a set of tablets protected from damp. The keeper doesn't read them for fun. He checks them when the sky shifts, and when a canal silts up he guards them because they tell him how to reset the system after a bad season. This is not faith alone, it's procedure wrapped in ceremony so it survives. Others dismiss this as reading too much into ritual. Perhaps. But rituals that resemble checklists tend to come from a history that needed checklists. Walk back to the scribe's room. The night has deepened. He's still there, stylus ticking gently. His teacher taps a measure with a reed and corrects nothing. The line's already a line. Outside, the canal still holds the starlight. The city seems to know how to be a city, as if someone told it the story before it woke. The ground does not argue. The weight of this paradox accumulates. Most places show the rough draft before the fair copy. Sumer sets down the fair copy at the start critics counter, with gaps and missing layers. Supporters suggest inheritance and a disciplined restart. Between the two, the artifacts keep repeating their quiet claim. System first, not trial first. If that claim holds even partly true, then the people of Sumer did not just find tools scattered in the mud. They unfolded a complete kit: mathematics, measures, astronomy, city plans, and taught themselves to use it as if they were remembering the blueprint for living together arrived with the bricks, and the sky told them when to begin. The thought is steady, not breathless. They rebuilt. Which brings an older record into focus. There are tablets that do more than count grain. They count years no one believes, and kings who reign longer than trees live. If a blueprint crossed the water, perhaps a history crossed with it. The next room holds copies of a list that sounds like a rumour, until you see how carefully it was preserved. The flood sits in the midline like a scar, and the story that comes before it feels unnervingly long. Lamp smoke curls in the archive air, and clay dust clings to your tongue. A curator sets 3 tablets side by side on a felt pad. The wedges line up too neatly, names and numbers falling into the same grooves as if one hand wrote them all. But the seals differ. The clay colour shifts from city to city. Nipper, Isin, Larsa. The room is cool, the stone floor holds last night's chill, and each tablet carries the same quiet charge. An official list, copied with care, where time stretches beyond anything a body can survive. You run a fingertip over a corner chip and feel grit. The labels do not say myth, they say King List. The shelves around you hold tax accounts, barley tallies, boundary disputes. These live in the same tier. The implication hangs in the still air. Whoever stored them believed they belonged to the real world, not a fireside tale. The waxed cord around the curator's ledger squeaks as it tightens, a small sound in a room that was built to keep noise away from clay. Field notes tell how they surfaced. One tablet came out of a temple archive at Nippur, buried beneath later renovation floors, pressed under a dump of old bricks. Another lay in a palace stack at Isin, lost behind collapsed shelves, its edge blackened by a long-ago oil lamp. A third turned up at Lhasa, tucked with trade treaties and boundary oaths. They sat where clerks filed things that mattered. Supporters suggest that context is the strongest clue. These were records, not hymns. Others dismiss the context as habit. Scribes copied everything. Still, the storage speaks with a steady tone. Now the numbers. 8 names before a flood. Combined reigns. 241,200 years. Individual spans that fall into clean counts. 36,000, 28,800, 43,200 units that fold neatly into base 60. That math governs their weights and their clocks, and here it shapes time itself. The pattern looks intentional, not the wobble of a rumour critic's counter that such figures must be symbolic, a scaffolding to place human rulers under divine measure. Yet the regularity across copies sits there like a solved equation. It resists hand-waving. The clay carries more than counts. A scribe's hand learned in a strict school, strokes uniform, spacing even. You can feel the pressure where a stylus pressed harder on key signs, names of Alulim, Alangar, Enmenluana. The wedge tips catch lamplight. Someone pronounced those syllables in a low voice as they worked, not for theatre, but to avoid mistakes. The way a baker mutters weights, the way a surveyor counts paces. The act of copying becomes a rite, a transfer from memory into matter. When the line breaks, it breaks like a dropped bowl. After the flood swept over, the numbers fall to something a body can hold. Decades, not thousands. The list does not soften into poem to explain it. It simply cuts to a new register, as if a clock was reset and the hands set to noon. The change is so stark it feels like a seam in a geologic wall. Before that seam, reigns measure in grand cycles. After, kings age and die in the span of a field's irrigation plan. Some whisper that these pre-flood spans hide an astronomer's code. The counts mirror long cycles, great years, eclipse patterns, repeating sky paths that take more than a lifetime to chart. It would fit a world where time was read off the heavens first, then draped over court and city. Others prefer to see ceremony, numbers chosen to show sacred order, to bless early names with cosmic weight. The trouble is that the pattern repeats from city to city, scribe to scribe, as if following an inherited template whose logic had outlived its explanation. You can picture a copyist in Isin. Oil lamp hiss, warm clay giving under a stylus cut from date palm. A basket of older fragments at the scribe's left. He checks each line twice, breath held when he passes the flood line. Not because he doubts, but because the shock of the drop never quite dulls. He leans back to relieve a stiff spine. Outside the archive door, someone argues about a shipment of sheep. Inside, time extends and snaps like a rope pulled taut, then sliced clean. Archaeologists tracing these tablets' paths point to their neighbours on the shelves. Trade logs, temple inventories, land transfers, lists of offerings by date. The King List sits in the same stream. That placement argues for sincerity. It does not prove truth, but it shows belief. The people who kept these rooms lit and dry thought they were preserving memory, not theatre, and their care has weight. Clay, after all, is heavy. No one moves it twice unless it matters. The floodline links to other calendars of catastrophe. Egypt's tales of the followers of Horus stretch backward into a hazy age of long-lived rulers before a renewal. In South Asia, the Yuga scheme lays out vast cycles of rise and decline. Mesoamerica measures time in long counts that reset at great intervals, with rulers woven into sky rhythms. These echoes do not make a single song. They do hint that many memory systems carried both reigns and cosmology together, like twin threads twisted into one cord. The ground in Mesopotamia offers faint answers. Below Eridu, layers show structures older than the city's formal start. Flood sediments lie like a blanket between phases. At Kish, too, water-laid silt wedges itself under early walls. The dates are debated and the lines blurry as dirt often is. Still, the profile of interruption and rebuild matches the list's sudden turn from ageless kings to men whose bones would fit a modern coffin. Not proof, but a rhyme you can hear when the room is quiet. Consider how the numbers themselves feel under the tongue. 36,000, 43,200. They are not round in a base 10 way. They are exact in a base 60 way. They carry the flavour of mathematics used in astronomy, in angles, in time. Supporters suggest that the list encodes observation archives disguised as royal spans. If you can't preserve a sky catalogue in a world that measures authority by lineage, you weld the two. Criticism meets that idea with a shrug. Clever, but unnecessary. Yet the tablets, stamped and sealed, do not shrink back. Scholars who try to tame the figures with lunar calendars run into walls. If each year were a month, totals still tower. The pattern's internal harmony resists conversion tricks. Symbolism explains one line, perhaps two, but stumbles on 100 repeated marks across cities. The scribes behave like accountants guarding precision. It is one thing to tell a myth. It is another to submit a ledger to the archive and say, "This is how time was kept." A small oddity. The lists vary in later sections, but hold closely in the first lines. The pre-flood core looks rigid, as though copied from an exemplar now lost. The flood acts like a blade, cutting the original scroll. After, chapters diverge as cities celebrate their own dynasties. Before, the names preserve an agreed frame. That cohesion hints at a shared source document deep in the tradition, carried temple to temple the way a charter travels with a caravan under guard. The human trace remains the most persuasive. You can feel it in the steady hand, in the effort to avoid stylus slips on names that were archaic even then. A young apprentice might ask an older scribe what Alulim means. The answer probably was a gesture toward the sky and a sentence about the first. No lecture, just the practice of keeping names alive. Memory in clay has that humble edge to it. It survives because someone decided it was worth the work. If the list preserves even a fragment of real chronology from before the floodline, the implications widen. Sumer would not be the first to measure a city's life by the stars. It would be the inheritor of a record-keeping habit linked to observation, a kind of civilization memory that outlasted its makers. In that light, the abrupt completeness of early Sumerian institutions reads like a rebuild from files, not a slow climb. It suggests a library that never entirely drowned. The numbers harmony invites one more thought. 43,200 is not just a neat multiple. In some systems, it maps to cycles of the sky. Rotations, seasons counted in ancient steps. Supporters suggest those reigns might be the scaffolding of a cosmic calendar hung lightly on human names. The names gave it a story. The math gave it a backbone. Others dismiss this as pattern chasing. The clay does not answer back. It sits and holds both possibilities like a sealed jar. In the dirt below cities, the flood leaves its signature. Water rolls silt into smooth lenses, grains sorted by flow. A wall ends, and the next rises on a flat new surface. You can see this in stratigraphy drawings. Clean lines, labelled layers. The scribal line, after the flood swept over, matches the cut in earth with uncomfortable neatness. That neatness needles at the mind. It is either a remarkable coincidence or a memory dressed in the language of administration. The copy's spread matters. When the same early sequence shows up in distant shelves, it implies network, not accident. Tablets travelled, scribes gathered in seasonal markets, priests compared notes at festivals. A tradition like this survives through active care. It suggests an institution behind it. Temple schools that treated the king list like a baseline everyone agreed on, even while they argued about whose king deserved the next place. There is a soft terror in the thought that the numbers could be literal. It opens doors better left ajar than flung wide, not because the world would end, but because the world would be stranger. Time measured across spans no single person could witness. Knowledge kept by guilds that knew they held shards from an age before the Great Reset. Maybe those long reigns simply licensed authority. Maybe they preserved the cadence of the heavens. The pattern tilts in the light and its meaning sharpens, then blurs again. So where does that leave the clay on the table? Back under the felt, catalogued but not tamed. The king list holds to its double nature, document and enigma. It lives among tax rolls and land grants, yet whispers of a timeline that stretches beyond fields and walls. If it carried only dates, it would be dull. It carries a wound, a break, then stitches after. That is the detail that hooks and doesn't let go. If those pre-flood rulers governed in any sense, they didn't just live. They organised labour, assigned fields, watched the sky for omens that were really cycles. A structure survives a flood better if its plans exist in more than one place. Paper burns. Clay sinks and waits. What then did they send forward? Names, numbers, procedures, perhaps a way to read the firmament like a ledger. The next shelves in this archive might have the clue buried under less glamorous labels, waiting for a hand to brush the dust and find the thread that ties rule sky and survival into one long memory. Lamplight pools across a low table, warm and a little smoky from the oil. Your fingers press into the faint grit of a clay tablet. The surface holds the tiny ridges of someone else's tool, a rhythm of wedges that once dried in desert air. The clay feels cool on your skin. As you tilt it, shallow grooves catch the light like fine threads. A line repeats at the margin with the steadiness of a label, as if the scribe feared a mix-up more than a mistake. You listen to the quiet in the archive room. The door groans when the draft moves, and the smell of old fibre and dust sits heavy but clean. On this tablet, a word returns again and again. Me. Not as a blessing to chant, but as an item to handle. Some whisper these entries describe objects that hum and glow. Critics counter that the language is metaphor. Yet the tablet lists weights, containers, and the order in which attendants should lift, bind and secure each me before transport that reads like procedure, not poetry. Early readers wrestled with this. They tried laws, then decrees, then offices. None fit the verbs wrapped around me. The text says a me is carried in baskets, sealed in chambers, placed upon a foundation, and at times heavy as mountains or light as feathers. The scribe notes that certain me should not be touched after dusk and must not be set near wool, copper shavings or running water. If this is only an idea, why the fuss over baskets, seals and the hazard of moisture? The pattern tilts in the light and its meaning sharpens. You trace a passage where a me emits a song, then a shining that troubles the eyes. Another entry warns that handling a certain me alters the one who grasps it, and requires a wash, a fast and a night of silence before rejoining the temple staff. Supporters suggest these reads like specifications for artifacts rather than abstruse ethics. Others dismiss it as ritual language. But the script goes on to list storage racks, reed padding, and a weight noted as 6 hands and 1. A clerk in a hurry would not stack verbs and measures if they could use a single abstract word. Then the mood shifts. A riverbank glide, a boat low in the water, and cargo bound in twined rope. The text frames a night run between keystones. Inanna does not receive the me. She takes them. One by one they load. Me of kingship, metallurgy, writing, music, mathematics, each paired with a vessel or box, each tagged to a porter, each recorded with the care of a quartermaster. Some are tied in pairs so that they do not argue in the hold. It's a wry line if you want it to be. It also reads like a warning about interference between objects. The list goes long, over 100 entries with brief notes on the effect of each within its city. The me of song restores the hearing of the festival. The me of building makes the hand find square and level. The me of the river keeps boats from drifting when the moon is dark. A pattern emerges, take possession, and a domain lights up. Not a slow schooling, but a switch. A clerk who has never cut stone finds the plane. A navigator reads the channel even without stars. The text implies instant mastery. If this is allegory, it is startlingly practical. Down the colophon, a reminder. The me are counted upon lifting and upon setting. You read a smudge where the scribe pressed harder, as if to make the point bite. In the next line, the storehouse instructions begin. The chamber walls must be coated, doors must be bound with fibre that has not touched, salt torches are kept outside. There is a threshold that even the high priest does not cross without rites. The guide does not feel like worship. It moves like maintenance, one careful step at a time. You can almost see the rooms. A narrow corridor, cool even in summer. Clay jars with reed caps. A faint trace of resin in the air. 2 attendants whisper the tally before they lift a lid. They do not speak the full name of the me inside, only the count and the mark on the container. On a small shelf, tablets record changes in tone and glow. The scribe uses a simple scale. Quiet, soft, strong. If a reading sits wrong, they leave the chamber for a day. Risk and respect share the same breath. The line travels from storage to craft. A smith's yard. Heat presses your face and dries your lips. At the bench, a worker holds a strip of copper and waits for a sign. A shimmer, a note too low to sing, before pouring from a spouted crucible. The text lays out times and measures like a recipe. Only the recipe yields a uniform bronze difficult to achieve with guesswork and luck. He does not boast, he follows. His teacher points to a tablet, not the sky. An image returns, a group of masons drawing lines in wet clay and setting chords over them. With the MEA of building in the house, corners stop wandering and walls meet where they should. The text notes there is less waste and fewer cracked bricks. This is not a myth of heroes. It is a list of saved workdays. It reads like the way a farmer counts jars after harvest, honest and unromantic. The royal file threads through. Before taking the throne, a ruler holds the me of kingship, not in the mind, but in the hand. Without it, the city sits like a wagon without wheels. The scribe does not explain why a symbol must be handled to grant authority. He simply marks that, once transferred, the court runs. Complaints are heard, weights are standard, taxes come in measured baskets. It's dull, which is the point. Power becomes the ability to make routine function every day. A smaller passage covers shipping. When the city of Reed sends the me of music, it must be wrapped against damp. The carriers stack crates away from hull plank seams. They walk slower at night. They avoid shouting in the hold. Those details speak to fragility or volatility. If you're transporting poetry, you don't fuss with reed spellings for the crate. If you're transporting physics, you might. Some whisper the ME were a kind of encoded storehouse, a library you could carry that did not need readers so much as handlers. There is a lure to that. It would explain why a craft wakes in a place without apprentices, why a festival tunes up in time for the new moon, even when the priest who knew the songs is gone. Critics counter that the language plays too coy for real devices, and that later glosses return to decree and office. They have a point. Still, the old verbs pile up like crates in the corridor. One tricky paragraph mentions a me that names the stars and counts their wanderings. It sits not in the observatory, but in a shrine chamber with shuttered vents. The priest who uses it must fast and keep away from clay jars that smell of bitumen. He records eclipse intervals clearly and does not claim the insight as his own "the me told the number." If inherited knowledge had a ritual, it would look like this. A brief line tells of a me that cuts the weight of the river. Barges run upstream with fewer hands. The scribe credits the me, then writes the day's ration for the crew. Bread, dates, water. He is not impressed. He is accounting. The progress lands on the ledger, not the altar. In the wake of Inanna's theft, the temple staff writes new rules. You can feel their alarm in the strict tone. Doors are doubled. Oaths are sworn on common tools. Any visitor who offers songs without a name is turned away. Loss taught them caution. A world that can lose its manuals once might do so twice. Consider the claim tucked into a cracked corner. When the me of the plough entered the house, the field rose in rows like teeth. It's a small, vivid line. It might be only style, or it captures how an instruction set travels from chamber to furrow and remakes a morning for the man whose hands grip the beam. He does not care about cosmology. He cares that the ox walks straight and his family eats. The weight of this, if true, is quiet and large. Civilization would not surge because mines suddenly grew sharper in one valley. It would surge because someone unlocked storage and passed out keys. Supporters suggest that Sumer's fast climb looks less like creativity from a blank slate and more like activation. Switches flipped in cities that learn to carry, guard and deploy me not invention. Reassembly. Let the frame widen. Another room, later in time. A junior scribe rubs his eyes and counts entries again. He's careful with the older lines, he copies the units, even when the words feel strange in his own mouth. He sets the tablet to dry and acts like he's done nothing special. In his careful work, a world begins again. Back in the archive, the oil flame gutters for a second, then steadies. You run the edge of your nail along a register line and stop at a notation. Returned from the city of the boatmen counted and whole. Not all thefts hold. Not all losses are final. Some knowledge goes out, comes back, and carries a new set of fingerprints. If the me belong to a deeper age, then the gulf between myth and manual narrows. The heist records look like logistics. The rites look like handling rules. The sudden mastery looks like what happens when a tool contains the training you need tucked inside it, waiting in the dark for careful hands. The mind drifts to the night. The boat slipped off with a stacked cargo, to the sigh of rope and the wet slap of river on hull. How many cities woke different the next morning because of what lay under those reed mats? There is a final stubborn question the tablet will not answer. Who made the first P? A clerk writes that they came from before the waters. That's not proof, it is a clue. The language hints at packets built to survive, to be moved, cached and used after long gaps of hunger and cold. Supporters suggest the makers were those who remembered the world at the flood closed like a book. If so, Sumer did not create its libraries from thin air. It found them, pried them open, and followed the steps. You set the tablet down and ease your fingers, clay dust faint on your tips. Somewhere, past the door, a bell taps once to mark the hour. It lands like a small oath. The me sit unnamed behind walls in this tale, yet they move the story like hidden gears. And if they were designed to outlast ruin, the hands that shaped them must have stood in the afterring of a disaster and planned for strangers who were those planners. And how far back does their workshop reach into the dark? Night air rests cool over the Anatolian plateau. Crickets rasp in the scrub. A worker's breath fogs in a beam of lantern light as his glove slides over a limestone pillar that rises from the earth like a buried rib. The stone is smooth where hands have polished it clean. Grit crunches under boots, and the smell of dust and crushed time sits low to the ground. Someone wipes a trowel on their trouser leg and leans close. In the narrow cone of light, a fox's tail curls, a vulture's beak cuts sharp, and a belt carved around a T-shaped pillar gleams with cold, careful lines. You step closer, and the hill's quiet feels staged, like a theatre after the last audience drifted home. The shapes are not random. Circles of standing stones lock into geometry, with edges trued by a steady hand. A pale wind moves across the ridge, and the night sky lowers until it feels near enough to touch. That's when the voice at your shoulder goes soft and flat. We thought this was a shrine. It behaves like an instrument. The first shock was the date. Göbekli Tepe sits 12 millennia back from us, which places it 1,500 years before known farming takes off in the region. Standard timelines say you need fields, granaries and calendar-keeping settlements before you can marshal hundreds of people to quarry, shape and lift multi-ton pillars into perfect circles. Yet here, hunter-gatherer bands pulled off a coordinated project that reads like an engineering plan. Stone had to be quarried downhill, hauled uphill, and set precisely. Meals had to be prepared, tools maintained, and work sequenced across seasons. The old model phrase under each new spade of soil. Carvings cut with crisp edges push the paradox further. Vulture-headed figures stretch across pillar faces. Serpents ribbon in ordered rows. Wild boar, aurochs, foxes, and abstract marks repeat in a code that feels practiced. Some of the motifs map cleanly onto patterns in the night sky. Supporters suggest certain panels mirror constellations as they would have appeared during the Younger Dryas, the cold snap that slammed Earth when ice was supposed to be retreating. Others dismiss this as wishful mapping, but the layout's discipline is hard to wave away. The art is not doodled, it is executed with intent and, at times, a precision that seems to expect tools and techniques we are told did not exist. Then comes the choice to bury it. These circles were not left to crumble. Tons of fill, stone, soil, broken bits of older work were layered in with care. This was not a collapse or a windblown drift. It looks like a plan. Enclosures were sealed and stacked, one over the other, as if locking a door. Supporters suggest this was preservation against an incoming threat or a ritual of closure after the site did its job. Critics counter that ritual disposal can look like care too. Even so, the neatness unsettles. You don't bury a ruined house like this. You bury something you want someone to find intact when it's safe again. A field tech holds up a tablet and points at a radar scan. Only a small slice of the hill has been opened, maybe 1/20th. Under the turf and thistle lie more circles, more pillars, more geometry. The map looks like a constellation chart for the Earth. Dots and rings spread across a shallow slope. The scale hints at an organisation that wasn't supposed to be possible for small mobile groups. If only 5% is visible, the unseen part could redraw what we call beginnings. It also builds a second tension. Every trench answers a question and opens 3 more. Here's where the symbols start to talk across centuries. A vulture with outstretched wings, hands linked around a belt, a certain crosshatch motif. Elements like these surface later in Mesopotamian clay. On early tablets, goats, lions, serpents and star clusters carry meaning beyond tallying sheep. The geometry under the carvings echoes too. Careful right angles, nested circles, ratios that show up again in sacred spaces far away in time. Some whisper this is cultural continuity after disaster. Pieces carried by groups moving downhill into better weather and easier winters. Others dismiss the echo as inevitable pattern making by the human brain. The rhythm of repetition remains. What about metal? The site is older than metallurgy as we define it, yet the line work can look as sharp as if drawn with a narrow chisel of copper or bronze. You put your fingers near the grooves without touching, and the edges feel tight. The counterpoint says flint can cut just as cleanly in limestone when handled by someone who knows what they're doing fair. But the volume of cuts, the consistency of the relief, and the symmetry across pillars suggest a training tradition that ran long enough to pass mastery down, that implies continuity, which implies a structure. Now we're back to organisation before farms. The sky threads through all of this. The circles may align to solar and stellar markers. Openings face points on the horizon where the sun and stars perform their seasonal tricks. If you walk inside at dawn or dusk, certain pillars catch light differently. A shallow groove glows, an animal rises from shadow. It feels like instruction. The functions stack. A place of gathering, a calendar, a storybook in stone. Some whisper, the site was an observatory in the simplest sense, a place to watch, record, and time the return of events that mattered for survival. If a cold surge or a comet fragment had scarred memory, who would not keep a closer eye on the sky? The burial looks different through that lens. If you were guarding a curriculum, how to count winters, cross a ridge, store seeds, read the stars, would you leave it on a hilltop to weather and vandals? Or would you seal it, knowing someone would one day peel back the layers and learn? The fill at Göbekli Tepe reads like a decision to close a library without destroying its shelves. That is not proof of catastrophe. It does, however, make the site feel like a message in a bottle, packed tight and pushed beneath the waves of time. Zoom out to the region. High ground shelters like this dot the map in faint hints, and ground-penetrating surveys suggest sister sites under gentle hills not far away. The ring and pillar design repeats, with local quirks. If these hills were a network, the pattern speaks to shared methods and exchange long before cities. A carver at one hill could recognise the hands at another. A belt motif here, a fox there, a shared grammar in stone. It's one thing to dismiss a rumour, it's another to explain why it endures. Now tie this back to Mesopotamia without retracing old steps. The earlier city plans in the south take geometry as a given. The habit of marking time by the sky shows up with authority, not confusion. If knowledge moved with people, the southern plains may have received more than mouths to feed. They received habits of thought, the value of alignment, the need to track cycles, the sense that building begins with the stars. Critics counter that independent invention can produce similar outcomes. It can. Yet the dates and the motif suggest a line that stretches, even if it breaks and knots again. A small story to hold in your hand. A worker pulls a limestone fragment from a spoil heap at dawn. It carries a shallow groove that arcs cleanly and stops. He rubs dust off with his thumb, and the arc catches a sliver of early light. That arc mirrors one on a pillar still in the trench, and together they trace a circle that isn't stone at all, but a path in the sky. He doesn't call it precession or nodal regression. He just nods and places the shard gently on a shelf next to a thermos and a folded scarf. Human scale meets cosmic scale, and neither feels out of place. Some accounts suggest people moved south and east after the Younger Dryas chaos eased. The phrase, "after the cold," threads through Eurasian myth in different clothes. If groups carried a memory of the sky acting badly, they might have treated astronomy like fire, dangerous if ignored, essential if understood. A hill of carved stone could be both meeting ground and instrument panel. Later, when fields took root far away, the habit of watching would have followed. The value placed on tracking cycles would have seeded calendars, rituals, and eventually the administrative clockwork of early states. The hilltop's alignments invite test after test. Measure a pillar's face and you find consistent angles. Lay a straight edge along the seats and you get sight lines that work at certain hours and seasons. These are not random outcomes. A circle can be a circle by accident. A circle that frames a sunrise after months of work is a decision. Whether the builders were measuring, commemorating, or warning remains open. The thing that does not wobble is the care in the layout. Skeptics bring good questions. Could ritual alone yield such planning? Yes. Could flint tools account for the crispness? Probably. Could the burial be mundane, a byproduct of long use rather than a coded act? It's possible. But the total set, date, complexity, precision, closure, leans toward intention that exceeds a local feast ground. Each time you think you have it pegged, the site offers another quiet contradiction. And so, the timeline bends. If a knowledge centre existed on a hill 12,000 years ago, then later centres in the plains may have inherited more than stories. The parallels in astronomy, numbers and sacred geometry could be echoes of a single older language spoken in stone and night sky. If that holds, Sumer begins to look less like a spontaneous spark and more like a restart guided by stored memory. You can hear the argument forming even as the wind thins and the lanterns die down. All of this leads into a hard question carried by rock and weather. Sites like this do not close themselves. People do. The act of filling an enclosure with tons of stone and soil takes time, labour and purpose. Supporters suggest the purpose was protection from a threat that had a clock, a cycle in the sky that comes around again. Others dismiss that as reading fear into a dirt pile. The pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens. The hill keeps its counsel, but the sky above it has a long memory. Constellations drift on a slow wobble, and seasons shift in ways only careful watchers learn to trust. If Göbekli Tepe was a lighthouse for a dark sea of years, then the southern cities may have lit their fires from its banked coals. That implies a story much older than our textbooks allow, one in which bones, stars and stone conspire to keep time through upheaval, which leaves a last thought for the walk down the slope. If a hill in Turkey catalogues a way of seeing that predates farms, then the flood tales and restart myths elsewhere begin to sound less like allegory and more like field notes. The next ridge over hold more circles under grass, and beyond that, far away in the dry plains, a river bends around the first cities. Somewhere between these 2 points sits an event with teeth. You feel the air slip from cold to mild as if the world exhales after a long fever. Snowlines shrink on distant ridges, rivers loosen, then run with a bright glassy sound across a valley. Grass pushes through thawed soil, and the smell of wet earth rises like a promise that doesn't need to speak. Herds move where tundra once held them back. A child stands at a camp edge, palm warm on a mammoth's woolly flank, while elders point to a sun that lingers longer each evening. The rhythm returns, food returns, confidence returns, then the warmth falters. Not a gentle pause, an abrupt snap. The wind changes character, it cuts. Trees that were leafing turn brittle at the edges, then whole forests brown and go still. The old people know this wind. They tighten fur hoods and speak in short lines. Lakes skin over with ice where water was open a few seasons earlier. In a handful of years, weather that should take centuries turns on its heel. The world feels mistimed, as if a drummer lost the beat and the song buckled. Fire answers the cold. Across wide continents, charcoal builds a thin black seam through soil. It smells of ash and tar, a bit of varnish in the nose for anyone who digs. Traces inside that seam are odd. Tiny diamonds you cannot see without a lens, droplets of glass hardened in mid-flight, and iron-rich grains magnetised by heat that climbs above 2,000 degrees. These are not campfires. They mark temperatures a hearth cannot touch. Some call this a signature of the sky, a record pressed into the ground when something broke apart above us. Supporters suggest a comet arrived, not as a single stone but as a loose, bright flock. It spread across the atmosphere and released its energy in bursts. The blast lit forests that had just crept back into the open. Smoke rose in broad sheets and dimmed the sun. Soot landed on ice, darkened it, and sped melting where it should have slowed. The chain pushed the planet back toward a glacial mood. None of it waited for slow cycles. It moved at human speed, years, not centuries. Critics counter that climate can lurch without a visitor from space, that volcanoes and ocean currents twist the planet on similar timescales. The soil, quiet and stubborn, holds its beads of glass either way. The cold deepens and holds. For more than 1,000 years, the world sits in this altered key. People move to find warmth and food. Some camps fail and vanish without a trace. Others shrink to small knots on higher ground where wind strips the snow thin. Even those lucky spots come with a price. The sky is useful again if you can read it, the sun's path, the return of seasonal stars, the timing of a moon that swells and thins, all become tools for knowing when to plant, when to move, when to wait. Knowledge condenses into portable forms. Story becomes ledger. When the cold finally loosens, the change is fast in the other direction. Ice that took ages to build gives back water with speed. Rivers foul with silt, sea edges run inward, swallowing marsh, beach and meadow in a steady reach that never reverses. Where people had walked, waves chew new lines, shelves of land bridge once near coasts, then they do not. The tide climbs hundreds of feet in total, step by step, and that is enough to hide whole maps. If a village sat on flat ground, it needs only days of wrong weather to drown a memory. Names exist for what went under. A wide plain once connecting Britain to Europe turns to seafloor. A drowned shelf in Southeast Asia becomes a maze of tropical islands with a forgotten heart. Off India's western coast, fishermen cast nets over lines that look carved, not random. Some whisper that the first places to organise would have hugged those coastlines. There is food in estuaries, trade along easy water, and long flat horizons that teach the eye to measure and the hand to plot. When sea levels rose, those neat places would have fallen first, and the tide would have taken their plans with them. Travel east, where two rivers have made a delta that pulls builders like a magnet. Beneath ancient mounds are bands of clay and sand that only violent flooding can lay down. The layers do not drift in gently. They arrive like a slap, then pull back, then slap again. Texts from that region tell stories of a great water that comes without mercy. On their clay, people wrote a list of steps to build boats and seal hulls, and a set of instructions to carry seed, tools, and records. We are told these are myths. The ground below them wears a tone that makes them sound like saved memories. Supporters suggest the cataclysm arrived exactly when a young civilization was learning to stand. Not with cities and cranes, but with a stack of skills that needed quiet and time astronomy for counting seasons and watching out for rare, dangerous cycles, agriculture for steady food, stone and fibre work for long projects that outlive a single lifetime. Those skills are fragile. They can shatter in a single winter too many, or a spring flood too deep. When that happens, survivors keep what they can carry. They carry stories first. A woman on a ridge holds a clay seal in a leather wrap. She knows how to dry grain with smoke and how to choose a beam that will not crack under weight. She can read the winter sky and tell you when the river will rise. She knows 3 songs that store measurements. The words sound like prayers, they are recipes. Around her, the valley carries a cold that does not match the season. She speaks to her child about a fire that was not a fire, about a dark noon and a day when fish appeared in the fields. Elsewhere, an old man uses an oar blade as a straight edge and cuts shallow lines into wet clay. He has learned to mark a slope on a canal bank by watching how water falls when he drips it from a reed. He marks pouring times for seed and the number of hands needed to lift a timber. Light from a small flame makes his shadow jump while he works. He knows the names of 5 bright objects that do not twinkle. He does not know why they move as they do, but he knows they matter, and that his grandfather said to keep the list safe. The theory that a cosmic hit began this long freeze, then long thaw, is still contested. Others dismiss it as a neat story pinned to messy data, but the smoke layer and the strange particles inside it keep a quiet pressure on the debate. If a skyborne visitor did break and burn above the planet, the speed of the change makes more sense. The trauma fits into a human lifespan. You could be born in a valley with soft air and die in a wind that tastes like iron. Look again at the coastal lines that are now gone. The drowned plains are large enough to host networks, not just huts. There is room there for people who found rhythms that lasted beyond memory. If they had calendars tuned to the stars and tides, those clocks would have been thrown off by the impact and the smoke. If they had places where people learned and stored what they learned, those rooms would now be under waves. Supporters suggest the best we can hope for are the drifted remains. A story about a flood here, a date that makes no sense there, and a set of measurements that look out of place in the hands that held them. As ocean lines stabilised, the low ground between the twin rivers became a haven again. Silt made the soil generous. The flood marks on buried walls tell of danger, but the return was strong enough to risk it. People arrived with memory, not blueprints. They dug straight canals and made bricks of the same size, as if copying a format rather than inventing one. They wrote lists and rules as if writing itself had been urged on them by the fear of forgetting. Their stories begin not with a perfect dawn, but with a day of loss. Around cook fires, the elders switch between tales of stars and tales of water. Those two themes share breadth in many cultures, but here the link is tight. The stars warned. The waters came, seeds were saved. Some speak of beings who knew things already, who taught how to measure and grow. Critics counter that every society imagines teachers to grant weight to old knowledge. Perhaps so. Yet the flood stories repeat a detail that has the bite of lived days, instructions with numbers. The ground in Mesopotamia bears the record of violent inundation. The texts above it offer the memory of it in a form that repeats through generations. The match is not proof. It is a pair of hands reaching across time and finding a grip. If you allow the idea that the big freeze and the following melt erased places where complex work had begun, the later rise of careful cities near these rivers feels less abrupt. It feels like salvage. A hunter in the north watches a group of animals fail in fresh snow and chooses a route he did not plan. A boatman in a delta finds his route blocked by new sand and swaps reeds for wood. Small choices begin to layer up. New maps appear, drawn in charcoal on long bones. The waterline walks inland and does not turn back. People who remember the old shore keep its image alive with compass lines and myths. They also count the days between solstices with a neat method a grandmother taught them. Critics counter that human societies can leap in complexity when climate allows. No impact required, no ghost civilization behind the curtain. They point to natural variability. They ask for ruins and tools, not sandwiched layers of glass and ash. The demand is fair. It also meets the hard fact of rising seas. Many ruins and tools that would settle the contest may simply sit under cold salt, their facts softened by tide. That is not an excuse. It is a limit. A shepherd shapes clay into a small tablet, then presses a mark to track a debt of barley. He learned this from an older man who learned it from someone who said water erases memory. Unless you trap it in signs, the boy does not know anything about comets or black carbon. He knows winter came fast once, and that his grandfather's song about star cycles helps with harvest. The knowledge wears a practical skin. It keeps people fed. It also carries a rumour of an earlier time when such ideas were common. The shift in thinking sits right here. If the younger Dryas cut down an early web of skills and structures, then we are not looking at a miraculous beginning later on. We are seeing a restart that took hold where the land allowed it. The timing fits the way people pass on complex habits, in fragments, sung through the dark, packed tight into stories and lists. Supporters suggest that what returns in the river plain is less invention than recovery. Let the frame widen as evening settles over the dig. The field team brushes a layer of silt from a broken wall. In the dirt, a thin, dark seam runs like a scab across the profile. Above it, a city grows. Below it, a different world. Someone smooths a small slab of clay and notes a date and a depth. In a quiet tone, he recites part of a flood story his grandmother told him. He is not religious. He is tired. He is marking what the earth says as faithfully as he can. The tablet cools in the night air and holds the print of his thumb. So the thought carries forward. Those early tablets that whisper of a great flood may be the last voice of a vanished age, speaking through hands that refuse to forget. If so, the river cities that rose after the cold were not alone in their work. They had help from memory, and memory has a habit of pointing to where the first teacher stood. The clay is cool and damp. Your thumb leaves a shallow groove as you steady the tablet for one more line. In early Eridu, the reed pen scratches softly, a dry whisper against wet earth. Oil smoke hangs low, sweet and bitter, and the night air slips through the reed screens with a faint chill. The elder's voice is worn and careful. He doesn't raise it. He repeats each phrase until your hand matches the cadence. His parents told him of water that climbed faster than a man could run, of days that felt like night, of boats built not for river trade but survival. He swears the cargo was more than sheep and barley. In the dark between breaths, he calls them the plans of a dead world. The words you trace speak of a round boat with sides sealed against the flood. They name sizes in cubits, set beams at precise intervals, and call for pitch to be boiled and layered. The story does not thunder with divine commands. It speaks through a reed wall, low and urgent, like a neighbour passing along warnings from the river seeds are counted. Tools are wrapped, clay jars marked, and something else. Tablets, bundles, lists go into dry storage under the deck. None of it reads like a prayer, it reads like work. Atrahasis takes shape here as labour more than legend. Directions march down the clay in tidy lines. There is no heroic flourish, only measurements and methods that sound like a builder's notebook. Supporters suggest this is why the story endures. It treats the flood like a solvable problem if you follow the checklist. Waterproof the seams, plan for weight, protect your records. Critics counter that myth often borrows the tone of craft to make the tale feel real. Either way, the tactile detail grabs you. It's a survival manual disguised as an epic. The strangeness deepens in the margins. The same tablets pair practical boat building with notes about metals that hold sharp edges and timing that matches long sky cycles. You run a finger over numbers that don't belong to simple farm life, counts that fit lunar rhythms, day totals that shadow planetary paths. The elder doesn't call it astronomy. He calls it a way to know when the hurt will return. The mix feels impossible for a village on the mudflats, yet the script treats it as normal, a memory set down to last longer than breath. Eridu Genesis adds an older shoreline to the scene. Before the waters, it says, there was kingship. Not merely a chief with a loud voice, but a formal order. Gates, courts, schedules, predictable seasons and rules carved into clay. Then the river lifted, thick with soil, and the line broke. You can still walk the deep silt under certain ruins, compacted into bands that glow different colours in lantern light. People who dig for their living point to those layers and nod in a way that does not ask you to believe anything. The ground feels heavy with a story that left a mark. The tale of Utnapishtim meets you in a different voice, a traveller's report carried by a king who wanted more time. His account brings the feel of the air just before the sky goes wrong, pressure changing, a sour taste on the tongue, birds that won't sit, then a rush, waters striking land with a sound that empties your chest, days without a dawn. When it ends, the land is scrubbed raw. Some whisper that the pattern of ruin mirrors the scars left by the last great cold snap, when fire and ice argued over the planet and shorelines leapt forward. Others dismiss the match as coincidence. The text itself keeps its eyes on the deck, on the pitch, on the rope, on the moment the ground returns under the boat. Here is the part that pricks at the back of the mind. These may be the first full stories ever pressed into clay, and they do not start by praising the beginning, but by describing the end. Writing appears not as a dance of creation, but as a ledger against forgetting. The earliest lines are not crowns and victories. They feel like a community packing memory into durable containers, the way you would wrap grain for a long winter. The pattern tilts in the lamplight and its meaning sharpens. Maybe script began as rescue, not art. Some details seem planted for future hands. Phrases repeat with small changes that lock in numbers and steps, like songs designed to survive gaps in a singer's breath. The elder teaches you to copy the chorus without dropping a word. The method carries the message. Knowledge gets hidden in ritual, where it can live even if the story's surface shifts. Supporters suggest this is by design, an encoded warning threaded through belief so it would pass guards who prefer prayers to plans. Critics counter that we read too much into rhythm because we want an old world to speak to us. The human chain stays clear even when centuries pass. The herbs smoke from the lamp, the grit on your lips, the way the reed pen roughens when it hits a grain of sand in the clay, all of it marks a record built by workers, not by ghosts. These scribes kept their shoulders close to the same burden, hold steady the memory of a storm that took the scaffolding of their world. They did not have spare words. They wrote as if time itself were thinning. At the edges of the flood set, another tablet leans on the table. It carries a diagram that doesn't suit the river life. Coils, seals, and numbers that speak to charge and flow. The elder doesn't touch it. He says it came from people who learned under different stars, people who left their tools in baskets and their rules in compact lessons that can travel. If that tablet holds true, the line from boat to blueprint is unbroken. The craft that saved bodies also saved methods, not invention, but inheritance. Eridu's walls, even in ruin, lift that idea into air. Their oldest bricks sit in neat rows like a memory picked up and set down again. Drains align, floors drain to basins lined for safety. The feel of a place that knows how water misbehaves lingers in the clay. The story does not brag. It traces an old curve with new hands. Some whisper that the city's planners learned from a drowned map. Others dismiss it as the best that clever farmers could manage. The earth keeps its own counsel. You follow the written flood up into later lines where the tone turns reflective. The survivor meets the questioner and tells his version twice, slightly apart, like he doesn't trust a single form to carry the weight. He lists the birds' scent, the sounds they make, the way the air tastes after the waters fall. These are not the details of a stage performance. They live in the mouth of someone who watched the river chew homes to clay and then spit everything back in new shapes. The record feels like eyewitness memory pressed flat by time, then steamed open by a careful reader. There is an odd clarity to the parts about storing knowledge. The instructions do not limit themselves to food and animals. They name lists, tablets, things written down, and methods preserved for those who come after. This sits awkwardly in a world that supposedly learned to write for trade counts. The clay says survival first, commerce later. Critics counter that traders always cede the habit of writing, and the flood simply claimed the spotlight. Even if so, the first major story we find points its light at loss and recovery. That matters. The elders' practice of telling and retelling did more than pass time. It taught a way to hold data in the body. Refrains fix numbers. Paired phrases secure sequences. Gestures match steps. Children learn to carry the frame before they can read the lines. When the reed finally lays wet syllables into clay, the rhythm is already old. The result is a text that behaves like a storage jar. It looks fragile. It travels better than it should. You lean back in the dim room and let the smoke gather. A few reeds clack in the wind outside. The elder has said the same names for years, and you can hear where his voice always breaks. His own house was built on ground. His family claims was higher in their grandparents' time. Wrong, of course, but the point lands. History stutters. People shift to keep it going. The flood turns the future into a debtor's ledger. Pay forward what you can. When the world's libraries finally took these fragments and set them upright in glass, the hush around them changed. Hands that had never felt mud saw boat plans from a past that did not bother to flatter the gods. The people who first worked out the signs found themselves staring at reports, not sermons. Some whisper that this discovery shook quiet rooms, where timelines were held together by habit and hope. Others dismissed the ripple as gossip. The fact remains, the oldest stories we can still read devote their finest care to catastrophe. Threads cross the continents. In valleys far from Mesopotamia, old stones carry tales of long water and a compact between survivors and their tools. You hear the same drumbeat of lists and measures, the same odd pairing of ritual language with simple instructions for making things that last. It's one thing to deny that all these tell the same event. It's another to explain why so many cultures protect the same shapes in their memory. Work. The clay in your hands doesn't argue, it simply endures. The more you read, the more the flood cycle feels like an operating system. Clear the board. Save what matters. Deploy the packages when land returns. The me, the craft, the lists, the star paths that anchor seasons after the sky changes. Each behaves like a module that can be cached, carried and loaded on boot. Supporters suggest this is no accident, but the design of a people who planned for the worst and built redundancy into their lore. Critics counter that any culture hit by disaster will converge on similar stories. The difference lives in the technical debt of these texts. Even the voices inside the stories protest the violence of the solution. A whisper comes through reeds, not temples. The warning travels through back channels, not palaces. It sounds like guilt riding under duty. You hear people arguing across the wreck, deciding what knowledge gets to survive and who holds it. The arguments smoulder inside the lines. When lore returns to the cities, it arrives with an aftertaste of flood. That makes sense if the first writers were crisis managers. The work of copying is slow. Clay dries, fingers ache. You swap reeds when the tip splays. Names blur when the elder speeds up. He stops you and starts again. He insists on the placement of a single number. This matters, he says, because the next river won't be patient. Whether the cause is sky or sea, or the hand of angry beings, the water doesn't bargain. The boat floats, or it doesn't. The archive makes landfall, or it dissolves. The narrowness of that edge fuels the care inside the lines. At last, the elder nods and sets his hand on the tablet. You can see where his palm leaves a faint print in the damp clay. It will stay there after he's gone. The mark is not sacred. It is proof of labour, of a body anchoring words that claim to outlive bodies. You carry the tablet to a shelf and turn it so the air dries it evenly. Outside, the reeds rustle. A river slides past in the dark, quiet and full of memory. If the disputed technical tablet came from the same stream of hands, the jump from flood protocol to device design becomes less strange. A people who packed seed lists and law codes against a storm could pack procedures for craft and power. The leap feels shorter when you see the line as one act. Store knowledge that keeps communities alive. Some whisper that the blueprint traces arrived soaked and smoke-stained, saved by a boat not much different from the one in your tablet. Others dismiss the link as romance. The clay holds its pose and lets us decide. Years later, when a young scholar bent over these signs in a museum basement, the room went very still. He wasn't staring at myth. He was reading a dispatch from the edge of a world, not a sermon, a report. And in that weak light, you can almost hear the reeds scratching again, keeping time against the long dark, as if the old scribe had finally found a way to send a message forward to people who would argue about it in languages he could never name. The basement air holds coal dust and the faint bite of lamp oil. You lean over a scarred wooden table beside a young man with ink on his cuffs and a stubborn crease between his eyes. George Smith drags a finger across a clay shard, breathes out, and the flicker of the wick catches a line of wedges just right. The signs settle into a pattern he knows from Sundays, from pulpits and printed tracts. And yet this tablet is older, much older. A boat, a storm, a family that endures. He doesn't shout. He grips the table, knuckles pale, and begins to copy the lines before the light falters. Upstairs, the city carries itself with steam and horse breath. But down here, the room stays warm and close. The clay smells of old riverbeds. The writing flows like the water it remembers. Smith traces another column and stops on a measurement that would fit a shipwright's ledger. He quietly repeats the words under his breath, the way you test a key in a lock and finds the tumblers moving. It's the story the West thought it owned, only this version came first. By morning, the shock runs ahead of him. Broadsheets stack at kiosks like a rising tide. The phrase, biblical stories not original, leaps from lead type into parlours, chapels and coffee houses. Ministers send urgent notes for gatherings after evening services. The polite hush of museums thins. In the corridors, scholars lean close and whisper about tablets, pulled from ancient ruins that now speak in a voice older than Genesis telegraph lines clatter all day. The news moves faster than carriages can. It doesn't slow for comfort. In the museum, doors close softly and lock. Meetings stretch long into the afternoon, the kind that produce neither minutes nor smiles. Letters are drafted to colleagues in Berlin and Paris. A cable goes west, then another. If Sumer recorded the flood first, a quiet dread follows. What else did those tablets preserve before the accepted beginning? And how will the story hold if its first chapter shifts? The machinery of caution begins without fuss. Early pencil notes that read too plainly slip into restricted folders. A handful of clay fragments take a different path from public trays to private drawers. A catalogue number that once ended in a neat sequence now carries a correction mark with no entry to match. Some call it prudence, a pause for verification. Others dismiss the tone, hear fear in it. In the stacks, a clerk writes and rewrites the same line until the ink blots. Smith breathes the pressure. He is self-taught, which draws both praise and knives. The wheeze in his chest worsens through damp London weeks. Colleagues who once patted his back now linger at doorways, weighing whether to step in. He visits the reading room and finds faces set hard, not unkind, simply wary. He returns to the basement, to clay and lamplight, and feels the weight of opening a door others might prefer sealed. Then the record grows uneven. A crate labelled with a neat hand, Nineveh, 312 tablets, arrives as 267. A list from Eridu mentions a box with 2-star texts of unusual character, then the box is logged as miscellany, damaged. Translations in newspapers cannot be matched to anything in the main registers. A shipping note claims water damage, but the porter swears the canvas stayed dry. It sounds like fog and hears like static, yet the gaps don't close. Across the channel, arguments sharpen. German philologists doubt a verb, but not the age of the clay. French classicists frown at the parallels. American lecturers wave them as proof of higher truth, and then stop short when the dates refuse to behave. The quibble moves from script to meaning, from faith to chronology. It's a bruising dance. Accept the object, avoid the implications. The contradiction tires the room and makes the hallways feel colder. Underneath, a quieter panic curls tighter. It's not simply that a flood tale stands older than the Bible. It's the hint that Sumer carried more than moral stories. Some whisper the tablets include astronomical cycles and spans of rule that stretch beyond a human lifetime by factors of 60, as if the ancients kept time on a cosmic clock. Supporters suggest these traces point to a pattern of rise, calamity, and careful rebuilding, where memory moves forward in packets, clay, verse, ritual, waiting for a safe pair of hands. In that frame, the frantic catalogue edits feel different. Not a tidy archivist day, but a stream diverted. Critics counter that bureaucracy explains everything. War, damp rooms, clumsy crate handlers, maybe. The puzzle is that the iron filings seem to jump toward the same magnet. The missing items, the sealed notes, the late-night reassignments cluster around flood narratives. Long spans of rain and Skylaw ordinary losses should scatter. These don't. Back in the basement, Smith's lamp throws a small halo. He returns to passages that bothered him, chewing bread gone dry while the heater ticks. He copies the name of a city twice and notices a break where nothing else breaks, as if a hand hesitated over a word that would cause trouble if read aloud. His cough comes harder, and his letters get thinner at the tail. The work leans on him, and he keeps leaning back, stubborn as ever. He isn't alone in feeling the strain. A junior assistant, good at figures, is assigned to reconcile acquisitions with the register and develops a polite headache that never quite goes away. A visiting clergyman asks to see the flood tablet, studies it for an hour and leaves with his forehead lined deep. A sermon rewritten before Sunday's light across town. A printer sets the headline again, sure of sales but wary of neighbours. The blast does not come from a single strike. It's the hum of many small engines warming at once. Meanwhile, in the back room, stacks grow. Some are benign, receipts, condition notes, shipping disputes between museum men and transport men. Tucked between them are short, firm instructions about storage and access. Clay goes here, not there. A certain drawer takes a lock it did not need before. Not every change hides a motive, and yet the rhythm of them carries a tune you can't quite stop hearing. Questions widen. If one story leapt the lane lines, how many others wait in the second shelf, bottom right, behind sheets of onion skin paper? Supporters suggest a cache of sky charts implies observing traditions older than the cities that copied them. That would mean apprentices learning from masters who learned from survivors, the way a family recipe persists even after the house burns down. It's a plain image, and it won't leave. The academic world splits, not by country, but by appetite for risk. Some prefer to fold the new text into the old frame. Allegory, parallel invention, a common well of myth. Others say the numbers and measures look like records, not parables, and the clay carries the weight of ledgers, not the light of fable. No one agrees, but almost everyone agrees to speak carefully in public. The Victorian ear listens sharply for heresy, and patronage has a long memory. Smith becomes a figure people talk around. He keeps translating and gives talks that stop short of the edges he sees. His health slips further. He travels east to look for more pieces, driven and tired, knowing each fragment could cool the room or heat it to a boil. He writes letters that alternate between delight and dread. You can feel the pull, discovery as a bright engine, consequence as the load it drags up the hill. A rumour surfaces, boxes from Kish, early strata temple archive. Arrived light by 3 tablets, the most carefully inscribed among them. A porter mentions a gentleman in a dark coat with the right keys at the wrong hour. The porter later says he remembers nothing. The gentleman appears in no ledger. The story is thin, and yet thin stories tend to circle the same lamppost when the ground under it is uneven. What terrifies the stewards of the age may not be the flood alone. It's what swims in that water. References to devices, to measures of the sky, to spans of rule that curve back on themselves like gears in a clock. If humanity runs in cycles, if the first cities rose on the shoulders of older ones, then the arrow of time bends into something less tidy than Sunday school paint's faith can adapt. Institutions adapt more slowly. Some whisper this is why certain catalogue numbers change overnight, why a few items take long vacations in closed rooms. Protect the public from confusion, they say, and protect the donors from embarrassment. Critics counter that such protection hollows trust. In the absence of a clear record, speculation thickens and hardens. It lives in the space between a missing tablet and a clerk's shrug. Even now you can stand outside the museum at dusk and hear the faint echo of that year's arguments, in the clatter of wheels and the cough of chimneys. The building looks calm. The windows glow. Inside, a new shipment arrives from the east under a grey canvas. Men lift crates with practised care, set them on the floor where the old crates once stood, and for a breath the room feels like a stage set being struck and rebuilt between scenes. If a single flood story in old clay could jolt a careful empire, what might a stack of star charts or a ledger of rains do? Victorians felt the tremor from one tablet. Supporters suggest more evidence waited, and some of it was steered into shadows before it could rattle the stained glass. Others dismiss that as romance layered onto routine. Between them lies a question that doesn't sit still. You return to the basement in your mind, to the lamp, the smell of river mud, the soft rasp of a stylus on a copy sheet. This scene seems simple until the details sharpen, a name scratched out and rewritten. A crate with a neat hole in the side, a line of numbers that counts far past a lifetime. If authorities flinched at the first ripple, you have to wonder what size of wave they saw coming from the tablets, still wrapped in hemp and tied with string. The truth, perhaps, is less a grand plot than 100 small choices made by careful men, each choice justifiable on its own. Yet patterns are made of small stitches. The seam runs from that basement table to a locked cabinet to a headline that won't be forgotten. And if some of the pieces really did vanish into quiet rooms, the sands that gave them up have a way of yielding more. The next tide from Mesopotamia was already on its way, and it would carry records that resist polite storage. You're in the underbelly of the British Museum, 1874. The air is cool and smells faintly of lamp oil and damp wood. Crates tower in crooked rows, their stenciled names: Nineveh, Eridu, bleeding ink where condensation kissed the boards overnight. The night watchman signs off, rubbing his eyes. The morning cataloguer arrives with a stiff ledger and a short temper. He flips to a page, taps a line, and stops 3 boxes listed. 2 on the floor. The manifest shows water damage from a storm the watchman says never fell. The crate that remains looks intact, but the nails are newer than the wood. Someone has been inside a box that never left the room. The scramble for Mesopotamia had rules that change with every bribe and border. Private buyers slipped coin to foremen. Military officers wrote their own permits on the road museum agents, stamped seals in languages they couldn't read, then hired guards who spent half the trip drinking and the other half scaring off rivals. Amid that storm of hands, you'd expect mismatched labels and lost objects. Yet some gaps cut too clean. Certain shipments reached Europe with their seals unbroken and their contents reduced, not at random but by type items with plain clay and tidy lists sailed through. Items with star diagrams, long counts, and unusual metals thinned out like they'd been skimmed upstream by someone who knew where history got weird. The first pattern shows up in the paperwork. Field notes from different digs talk about sealed crates loaded at dusk, checked again at the port with the same weight, the same wax stamp. Then the museum record shrinks the contents to a handful of items that don't match the notes. A tablet described in the field as astronomical chart with numeric table becomes fragment indecipherable. Copper pieces labelled on site as components of unknown mechanism reduced to miscellaneous metal fragments. Some whisper that this is just the usual mess of 19th century shipping. Others dismiss this as conspiracy layered over bad storage. The pattern tilts in the lamplight and shows the same kind of missing page every time. Eyewitnesses leave thin trails. A German archaeologist, careful to the point of dullness, notes that unmarked carriages rolled into camp a few hours after workers uncovered a tablet with odd columns and a device sketch. A museum clerk writes privately that certain items were to be filed separately for administrative review, then never saw them again. He later notes the new catalogue numbers don't link to any shelf. His hands shake a little in the margin where the ink pools. Supporters suggest this hints at quiet coordination, not simple chaos. Critics counter that rumours bloom in rooms where no one talks plainly. The gaps widen in wartime. During the Gulf conflicts, thieves didn't smash and grab the gold. They walked past gilded statues and stepped around ivory. They targeted clay. Drawers of tablets went missing, while bronze bulls and carved reliefs sat untouched on the floor. The pattern repeated in city after city, pieces referring to early king lists, pre-flood spans or star cycles vanished first. Easy profit. That's one answer. Yet clay sells poorly compared to gold. Some whisper that buyers ask for text, not treasure. Names, numbers and dates that could reset a timeline, boxed and carried out the back. Then there's the damage that looks too neat to be clumsy. Tablets reappear years later with sections scraped smooth in tidy rectangles, like someone erased a paragraph and left the rest. Edges break along lines of script instead of random cracks. Gaps land where odd years, celestial notations, or the old world would have sat dealers call it accidental. The angles disagree. If you've ever broken a plate, you know its edges don't plan their fall. These breaks feel planned. The missing parts are where the story might have cut across the grain of accepted history. The pressure often comes wrapped in politeness. A scholar submits a paper on a translation that stretches beyond the norm, and the grant dries up next season. A project with early results that bend old timelines gets postponed until better imaging is available, then never resumes. The researcher who keeps asking is invited to fewer conferences. The emails get shorter. Some of this is ordinary academic turf. Some of it goes further, funding bodies, from churches to state offices, once set terms, support settled narratives and secure donations or drift and go hungry. Others dismiss those claims as sour grapes from outliers. Yet the pattern maps too neatly to the objects that slipped away. It helps to remember how archaeology was framed at its start. Expeditions were pitched as proofs of scripture, and museums were more cathedral than lab. Many curators spoke in the language of corroboration, not curiosity. When a tablet did that, it got a safe shelf and a press tour. When a tablet didn't, it got a quiet designation and a locked drawer. This was not a single plot with a mastermind tapping fingers. It was dozens of small decisions made by people with careers to protect and donors to satisfy. In that world, miscellaneous becomes a broom, and the floor collects the sweepings. The missing artifacts change how we think about what's left. If shipments regularly shared the same kind of content, astronomical tables, King List anomalies, records of odd reign lengths, then the public archive may show as a curated shape. Not exactly fake, but simplified. Think of a map with the tricky bends smoothed out. It helps you drive, yet it hides the hairpin turns that define the mountain. We see tidy administrative tablets and grain accounts stacked by the hundreds. We see less of the sky texts and devices that would complicate the timeline. The shape of what survives guides what students learn and what professors teach next. The wars made these choices permanent in many cases. Notes mention whole cabinets gone from provincial museums. Old photos show drawers of tablets that do not exist now. Afterward, stray pieces popped up in private rooms. Backlit shelves with a single clay rectangle under glass, a corner scrubbed white. Provenance rarely came with the display. If a line spoke of a king before the flood, the scrape silenced him. If a number suggested a sky alignment that predates the expected window, the edge fractured there. Others dismissed this as coincidence in a world where damage is common. The cuts trace a story that keeps returning to the same nouns. Not everything vanished by theft. Some objects were misfiled by design. A set of copper pieces listed together in a dig journal. Fittings that locked into one another were separated into different museum departments and renamed. One became ritual fitting. Another turned into decorative insert. The third took a number tied to fragments. The pieces can't teach much when they can't sit on the same table. Years later, a junior staffer tried to reunite them and hit a wall of missing linkages. Catalogues change. Numbering systems migrate. When the bridge between lists goes, the trail ends in a room with no lights. Researchers tell quiet stories of the human toll. A translator receives crates with an early promise of unrestricted access. A month later, a supervisor asks for preliminary sensitivities before drafts go anywhere. Funding meetings take a sharper tone. A colleague suggests a sabbatical and a change of focus. You hear the tired humour in their voice in the hallway, the kind of joke that keeps you from saying what you mean. Supporters suggest these cases stack into a pattern. Critics counter that stories from exiles always sound the same. Why direct attention at unadorned clay when gold shines brighter? Because clay holds text. Text names dates, cycles, and events. Gold holds glory and myth, but it rarely contradicts a timeline with numbers. If you needed to manage the story of human beginnings in a time of upheaval, you'd likely care more about a tablet that links star positions to reigns than a statue that adds weight to a room. Some whisper that buyers sent lists in advance. The lists ask for night skies, floods and kings who ruled before the waters rose. What remains is a twofold question. How much of our past sits in private rooms behind tasteful drapes? And how much sits in public buildings under labels that don't mean what they used to mean? Neither question calls for outrage so much as meticulous care. You trust, but you verify. You read catalogue lines that look harmless, and you go find the crate that doesn't match. You talk to the clerk whose handwriting leans left when he's scared. You notice which drawers get new locks after a visit. Let the frame widen. Many of the items that slipped away or returned maimed pointed toward the stars. Constellation lists, sky charts, counts that only make sense in long cycles. Some link those patterns to royal years in ways that never reach the classroom. If those tablets had lived in the open, they might have sketched an older sky onto our younger timeline. If guarded lists treated a comet as the bringer of an ending, that would bind the heavens to the floods in a way that reorders cause and effect. The hush in the archive deepens as that thought takes shape. The basement falls back into its routine. Crates breathe in the lamp heat and give it back as a low warmth across the boards. A clerk sharpens a pencil and files a number he'll forget by noon. Somewhere uptown, a private buyer unwraps a tablet and tilts it toward a window, watching sunlight crawl along a line where names used to be. The ledgers upstairs will show a resolved shipment by tomorrow. Down here, the absence feels like a door left ajar, and beyond it waits a night sky carved in clay that no one wants to discuss at noon. Moonlight slicks across a clay tablet. A young scribe steadies his breath and presses a reed stylus into wet lines that glint like fish scales in the dark. The air over the ziggurat tastes of kiln smoke and cool dust. From below rise low voices, counting then falling quiet as if the night itself were listening. He isn't copying the sky he sees. He's copying one remembered in numbers, a sky learned the way you learn a song from your grandmother's low humming. Familiar, yet not tonight's tune. You watch his fingers pause at each star name. He checks a chord knotted with intervals, slides a small clay counter to mark a cycle, and inscribes a final note on the arc of a wanderer. The constellations he records do not fit the vault above him. They fit a ceiling from far earlier, like a map folded and refolded until the creases point back to another age. The page drinks every mark. Clay keeps what the voice forgets. Mul Apin enters here, not as a legend, but as a working compendium. Early tablets lay out orderly lists, rising and setting times, lengths of days, paths of the 7 visible wanderers, ways to fix equinox and solstice by the shadow of a gnomon. The catalogue stands complete at the doorway of recorded history, which is odd. You would expect rough drafts first, then corrections. Instead, the instructions feel finished. They read like a manual salvaged intact, numbers worn at the edges from long use. The details bite. Venus runs on a near 584-day cycle. The scribe knows this as a rhythm, counting evenings it blazes in the west, disappearances and returns at dawn. Those intervals appear in tidy columns with errors so small you could miss them if you blink. Lunar eclipses slot into patterns, grouped by months, with notes that let you project forward. Jupiter's looping synodic span is traced in a neat hand, not guessed by chance, but tracked, tamed into schedule. No lenses, no brass instruments, only patient nights, and an archive of nights before. Supporters suggest this precision betrays a longer memory. It's one thing to watch a planet for a lifetime and sketch its habits. It's another to treat those habits like a calendar wheel that turns without fail through a century of lamplight. Others dismiss the inheritance idea and credit a bureaucracy that loved tallying everything. Still, the scribe's focus feels older than him. His job isn't to discover. It's to preserve the pitch of the tune. A deeper rhythm hides in the margins. Precession, the slow sway of Earth's axis, slides the stars as if the whole sky were a clock hand moving too slow to see in a week, or even in a lifetime. Yet calculations embedded in early lists suggest an awareness of drift, of markers shifting against the equinox. The numbers that point to the wobble sit there quietly, like a note in the ledger that says, "This altar does not move, the sky around it does." Critics counter that later editors could have inserted this knowledge, but the clay's continuity feels seamless. The alignment speaks in older grammar. Now consider the odd misfits in the constellations. A few star groupings and their rising points suit a sky modelled not for 3000 BCE, but for a colder world. Patterns echo placements more at home during the end of the last ice's bite. Some whisper that the list copies older charts, not perfectly enough to taste the source. It's the way a story set by the fire holds one wrong bird call from a country you've never seen, carried by a traveller who lived there once. The ziggurat is not only temple, it behaves like a tool. Corners face the cardinal lines, brick courses stack with a builder's eye to sunrise and shadowfall from the summit. The night is sorted by walls and stairs, each edge a sight line. A small basin holds water enough to mirror bright stars, flattening them so a scribe can fix their place more cleanly. The whole structure watches the sky. Its angles teach. Its terraces time the day when the sun runs high, when seasons tip, when a festival must start because the numbers say the door is open. Molapin's voice is plain. It does not wear poetic robes. It sets rows of star names, their times, the way a market scribe lists barley and oil. That tone is its power. You feel the calm of a craft practiced long enough to lose the flash and keep only the steps. Weights and measures for the heavens. The catalogue even tags how a planet stutters, moves backward, then resumes, retrograde motion reduced to count and note. It reads like a city's heartbeat mapped to an older drum. There are scars in the tablets, lines break, words chip away. Yet a handful of phrases survive like warnings. The wandering fire, the star of the old world, the light that brings ending. Each could be a comet. They could be a bright brief flare where a star died. They could be something timed on cycles the living feared. The language doesn't shout, it files the event like a clerk entering a loss that must be remembered if you want to avoid it again. In one workshop, a boy carries a bowl of wet clay from a well room that smells faintly of copper and straw. He sets it near the window where a thin moon hangs. The master checks today's measure against a board rubbed smooth by fingertips. Venus will vanish for days. On another tablet, a note explains how to adjust for its absence and how to spot the return by the glimmer at first light. The instructions are both simple and exact, as if many hands wrote the same steps for generations and shaved off everything not needed to get it right. If these lists were only an art, they would speak like poems. Instead, their sentences stand like scaffold planks. They hold weight. The precession hints, the eclipse schedules, the planet cycles with counts that match modern numbers within small margins. Each pushes the mind toward the question no one in the room says aloud. How long must people watch to hear the sky's long notes? One life? Several? Or were the pages you hold recopied from a shelf not wrecked by flood, carried out by someone with ash in their hair? The temple's calendars track more than feasts. They align planting and harvest with a clock above, keeping food steadier when rivers misbehave. The sky is their ledger for debt and for mercy. You can feel urgency under the neat columns like the calm call-outs during a storm. If you trust the sky's pulse, you know when water likely swells, when heat might burn longer than it should. To treat the heavens as a city's backbone is practical, not mystical. If that practice began long before these cities stood, the records become life preservers, not trophies. Supporters suggest the mismatch between recorded constellations and the immediate sky comes from copying across ages, a kind of time drift that points to an ancestor archive. Others dismiss such readings and favour later editorial tweaks that backfill clever theory. The tablets do not answer, they sit. Their arithmetic works. Their tone remains unhurried and sure, like a teacher who has said the same lesson for 40 years, knowing where the questions will come and how to fold them into the next day's notes. You can walk the steps of a ziggurat at dawn and feel how the building turns the first light into a rule. A shadow's length at solstice marks a notch cut into baked brick. The notch aligns not only to today's sun, but to a pattern of many years. That habit of mind, tying stone to sky, number to season, looks like invention until you see how smooth it is. Trial and error leaves bumps. This surface feels worn by use, not chipped by guesses. In the archive room, a scribe runs a thumb along a line that estimates how many months between eclipses fit a set of years cleanly. It is a trick you learn from someone who had someone teach them. The method hums with patience. It also whispers of urgency. A city cannot afford to be wrong about when the night turns red. Not for fear of gods alone, but because those nights bring tides and panic and change. To predict is to stay calm. To record is to preserve calm for the next generation, who will also watch the sky with tight jaws and then exhale when the shadow passes. The odd references to an ending light feel like fingerprints left by memories of a burn. Some whisper these lines draw from the same wound that pushed early settlers to higher ground and made them honour the heavens like a ledger you update every market day. Critics counter that comets come often enough to populate many myths without invoking catastrophe. Both readings can sit in a room together. The important part is that the record cares, it fixes the timing. When you stand under a star map carved in clay, you feel the strange mix of awe and utility. It is beautiful in a way only a tool can be. Clean, honest, made to work. The magic lives in the work itself. That work implies a discipline so old it could pass as instinct. If a long night of disaster trained people to watch the sky like farmers watch their seed, then Mullapin is a harvest ritual as much as a science book. You keep what kept you. The deeper implication is quiet. Sumerian astronomy reads less like first steps, more like restoration. The scribes do not sound like explorers opening an unknown sea. They sound like sailors returning to a coastline their parents drew, updating the shoals and lights after a storm moved everything a little. That tone matters. It shifts the story from genius appearing out of nowhere to endurance. There is a twist in the shelves. The same tablets that map the stars also speak about beginnings. They fold stories of how people came to be alongside measures of how the sky turns. For this archive, creation and calculation share a table. The moon keeps the months and also carries a name. Venus has a cycle and a tail. If the star lists are inherited memory, the origin stories might be too. The scribe dips the stylus again, glances once at the quiet horizon, then writes a line that will lead us from the sky's schedule to the older question printed between those rows of numbers. Where did the ones who wrote them come from, and who taught them to keep time for a world that had to start over? Dust hangs in warm air as you kneel in the rubble of Eridu. The clay under your palm is cool, grit catching in the creases of your skin. A tablet rises from the soil like a flat bone, pressed with lines that feel deliberate rather than devotional. The smell is damp earth and fired clay. You brush gently and the wedges sharpen. Vessels, measured, purified, blood taken, cleansed. A sequence that reads like a procedure more than a prayer. The lines do not shout, they list. 14 containers. A chamber washed with water and cedar resin. A portion of essence added to earth clay and stirred until a specific colour appears. It sounds like a temple hymn until you read the verbs. Mix, filter, enclose, rest. The old hands that carved this weren't writing a poem. They were writing how to do something that had to be done right. Sumer keeps returning to the same names when the work turns precise. Enki, the keeper of fresh waters and deep knowledge. Ninhursag, the lady of the sacred mountain, midwife to creation. In these accounts, they don't wave a hand, they follow steps. Blood is drawn from a chosen source and carried in sealed containers. The chamber is fumigated with smoke. The clay is striated with fine threads before the seed is placed. These are the rhythms of a workshop, not a miracle. Some hear the echo of modern labs in those rhythms and nod. Others dismiss it as metaphor hardened over centuries. The truth perhaps sits where ritual and memory blur. Temple rooms in Nippur show drain channels cut into stone benches. In Babylon's older layers, you find small baked vessels with standardized volumes. Lined in bitumen to stop seepage, devotion can build orderly rooms. But procedure leaves a different mark. It leaves repetition, tolerances, a way to repeat an outcome across generations. Then there is Adapa, a figure carved as more than human, less than God, who carries knowledge as if it were a tool in his hand. He understands the speech of the sky and the measures of wind. He is offered the path to live without end, but turns from it, or has it turned from him? Supporters suggest the tale masks a design choice, wisdom upgraded, lifespan capped. After a world reset, you might want craftsmen who rebuild fast, not immortals who never leave the stage. Critics counter that this is only a moral tale about humility in the face of the divine here both. Let the pattern tilt in the light, and its meaning sharpens. Royal lines lean on blood when paper is scarce. Early kings in the south claim ties to those who came before the waters, not as smoke and thunder, but as ancestors whose line merges with human houses. When a dynasty in lists a mother by a name tied to a temple of healing instead of a palace, it reads like a quiet brag. We carry the old mix, we remember the vessel count. In a court, lineage is law. Outside the court, lineage becomes rumour with teeth. There's a harder question under that pageant. Did something happen to us that made complexity snap into place? The skull record from different regions shows shifts in the frontal lobes across a short window, paired with sudden leaps in symbolic marks, counting tokens, and long-distance trade. These signals cluster around stress events when ice retreated, rains shifted, and coasts drowned. Genetics adds its own quiet footnote, bottlenecks that narrow the human tree during turbulent periods. Supporters suggest a triage moment. A handful of lines carried forward traits that helped memory, planning, and language bloom after the crash. In the temple, memory hides inside repetition. Ceremonies at Eridu reenact the mixing with an order that never loosens. A priest recites vessel counts while assistants pour water over a sealed jar. The chant names substances that no longer exist in their pure form. They still grind substitutes to keep the shape of the action intact. If you can't keep a lab running, you can keep its shadow. Over time, that shadow becomes sacred. In one hymn, the room is washed 7 times. The ewer is placed on the left. The right-hand vessel is marked with a cord of reed. The blood is symbolic by then, a drop of wine. The clay is flour. The room hums with words that used to guide hands. It's not hard to see a line from protocol to rite. When a dangerous craft becomes faith, the steps survive even if the purpose fades. Inside Nippur, you can still trace grooves where liquids once ran. The benches, scorched and sealed, face inward, as if watching a central table. In later centuries, scribes call the room a womb. Before that, it may have been a clean bench by another name. The hymns talk about breath kept pure, doorways hung with cloth, the room made still of dust. Those are the words you use when you can't afford contamination. Or to put it another way, when you cannot risk the mix failing again. Think of a community trying to reboot a world with a handful of experts and a cargo of boxes. The skills that would jumpstart a city would not just be geometry and farming, they would be ways to stabilise a fragile population. If we read the stories as memory wrapped in worship, the urge to control bloodlines gains a colder, practical edge. Marriages align houses that remember steps. Protocols become taboos. Don't break the rule becomes don't break the line. The Adapa thread loops back here. A mind bright enough to keep the sky calendar and the irrigation schedule alive could save a valley, but immortality would clog the gears. Some whisper that's the subtext. Cap the span, keep the turnover, let renewal be built in, It is a tidy theory. It may also be a tale told by late-night minds staring at stars. Either way, the story holds because it balances awe with restraint. Someone lifted us. Someone kept us mortal. Archaeology offers a chorus of small, stubborn facts rather than one loud proof. Bone needles sharpen into fine tools overnight in some places. Counting moves from tokens to marks on jars with a speed that looks more like adoption than invention. The first clay tablets don't warm up with children's drawings. They jump to lists of grain, names and rations. Critics counter that selection bias makes the earliest tablets look more sophisticated because ephemeral early steps just did not survive. That's fair. Paper burns, soft clay crumbles, yet the pattern keeps reappearing. Where writing settles, it arrives with an adult's posture. Rituals keep the posture. In temples, the number 14 repeats. 14 vessels have precise positions around a central basin. The space between them is measured with a cord of fixed length. Purification steps mirror modern protocols in shape, if not in tools. Cleanse, seal, wait. Nothing in that proves genetic work, but it does show a culture that treated sequence and sterility as sacred. The old world's trauma taught them to care about order the way a sailor cares about knots. The biological implications turn personal when you think of the first children born into those rules. A mother being counselled about unions because a temple needed a certain match to keep its lineage memory from thinning. A midwife measuring the head of a newborn with a strip, reading not just health, but promise. Some whisper of priests marking babies with oil in patterns that map to older charts of traits, that crosses the line from plausible precaution to soft eugenics. Others dismiss it as a modern stain projected backward. What holds is the human cost. People navigate rules they don't fully understand because the elders say it keeps the city alive. If survivors guided our development, Sumer's fast climb looks less like an accident. Astronomy, mathematics and engineering fit together in a basket you hand to a child who is ready to carry weight. The child may not know how the tools were forged, but he learns how to hold them, so you get clean right angles in canals before you see practice ditches, so you get a number system fit for the sky without centuries of trial math. A strong mind and a strong manual make quick work. The temple laboratory never feels far away in the texts. Hymns list measures, and steps the way modern recipes list grams and minutes. A vessel must be 1 hand deep and 2 hands wide. The lid must be sealed with 3 turns of fibre. The smoke must curl blue, not white, before you begin. When priests mix symbolic substances in a careful order, we see devotion. If they preserve a template of a lost technique within that devotion, we see survival. Ritual as archive. Look again at those drains and benches. They're small facts, but they sit beneath stories that place blood and clay in the same bowl. Supporters suggest that an older civilization, wounded but stubborn, seeded its recovery by seeding us. That sounds grand. It may be true only in part. A few genes favoured here, a few practices there, just enough nudge to get traction on mud critics counter that our hunger to be designed flatters us. If we made ourselves by our own slow hands, that is also a strong story. The room at Eridu doesn't correct either, it waits. There's also the ethics hiding in the tablets. If someone adjusted us, who decided what better meant? Smarter could also mean more anxious. Longer memory could mean longer grief. A mind tuned for patterns can rebuild irrigation and also invent gods. After a flood, would you choose stability over freedom? These questions do not stay ancient. They sound like the arguments inside any lab that touches the code of life today. Somewhere in this we find the phrase, emergency preservation. It isn't in cuneiform, of course. It sits between lines. If your world is ending, you make copies, you stash tools. You push knowledge into objects, songs, and perhaps people. When the waters pull back, you want a mind that remembers how to build a wall, read a sky, and keep food safe. You don't need a golden age to plant a city. You need robust instructions and the heads to understand them. The mood of these myths turns less radiant when you read them that way. Enki is not a magician. He's a project manager with a hard deadline. Ninhursag is not a goddess floating in cloud. She's a technician behind a screen of reeds, counting vessels and watching temperatures with the back of her hand. It's less glamorous. It feels more human. The world off the table might be chaos, but in here, process holds. If that world existed, its toolkit was broad. The same people who could tune a mind might also harden alloys at steady temperatures and map sky cycles across generations. Those skills live together. The old lab and the old observatory could share a wall. The tablets hint that they did. A creation hymn sits beside a star map. A king list follows both with a note about a flood. To us, these are separate domains. To them, they might have been one long problem: how to carry a civilization through a storm. You brush the last grains from the tablet. The character for essence sits where you expected a god's face. The word for clay is the same as the word for flesh in some lines. They're not in others, as if the scribe was arguing with himself. There is a smudge where a measurement should be. Maybe a breath caught in wet clay. Maybe a hand trembled. If Sumer carried this kind of inheritance, then the civilization behind it knew how to bend life, long before metal towers and sterile rooms. That raises one more quiet question at the threshold. If they could do that, what else did they know that we haven't recovered yet? The tablet is steady in your hand, and somewhere beyond the sight the wind moves through reeds like a voice that refuses to say the last line. Warm air slips through broken brick as dusk settles over the canals. A reed pen scratches on clay, steady and practiced, while the city hums in a low, orderly way that feels older than the walls around it. You move past a kiln with a dull red glow, past a row of sealed jars marked with neat wedge signs. The scribe doesn't look up. He copies a table of numbers into fresh clay, not discovering, not experimenting, but restoring. There's a rhythm to it, like hearing a song you learned long ago and playing it by ear. Let the frame widen. Fields watered by canals that keep a straight line longer than a farmer's eyes can see. Brick stamped to a standard size, and a ziggurat that doubles as an instrument for the sky. The first breath of evening carries the smell of damp soil, pitch, and sesame oil. At the city gate a porter pauses, hand on a tablet lashed to his belt, waiting for a tally that never falters. Nothing in this feels tentative. It feels like someone came back to a scorched workshop, rolled up a toolkit that survived and said, "We know how this goes. Here's the heart of the inheritance hypothesis." Sumer looks less like an origin and more like a restart. Not a miracle out of nowhere, not trial and error crawling toward complexity, but a recovery, methodical, fast, and strangely complete. Supporters suggest the sudden appearance of writing, astronomy, codified laws, standardized measures, and engineered waterworks points to a cache of preserved knowledge. They see templates, not sketches. Others dismiss this as romantic storytelling layered onto scattered finds. Yet the pattern keeps reappearing in the clay and brick, in the way systems arrive fully formed, as if pulled from a surviving playbook. Think about the base 60 mathematics that organises time and angles to this day. It does not wander into view through crude counting marks. It arrives with place value, with reciprocals ready for dividing grain, with tables that assume long habits of sky watching. You can almost hear a teacher's voice repeating the cycles, the way a sailor learns a coastline by rhythm rather than maps. The same voice echoes in star lists that track slow celestial drift, in clean administrative ledgers that link field, labour, and yield with no beginner's mess. At street level, the restart reads like muscle memory. A metalworker lifts a crucible with a practiced grip. He tests an alloy by ring and sheen, hits a temperature range he learned from a recipe that names steps in words older than his city. That recipe lives on a tablet in a temple vault. It sits beside tables of weights, a list of canal spans, and a law code that assumes houses, trades, marriage contracts, and fines for broken sluice gates. Critics counter that cultures can leap forward when conditions align, but leaps rarely land this clean. Some whisper the Emne, those guarded objects of knowledge, were more than sacred symbols. In this telling, they were procedural archives, each keyed to a complete domain: surveying, brickmaking, ledger-keeping, metallurgy, city governance, sky law. If one city held the me of canals and law, and another held the me of astronomy and writing, the handoff of a set would look like what we see: new centres flaring into order without a starter phase. The detail that they were moved, borrowed or stolen fits a world, rebuilding through packets of instruction, rather than simple ideas passed mouth to mouth. Walk the canals to Eridu, where early layers meet flood-laid silt. The soil tells of a break, one era drowned, another placed above like careful stitching. In the newer layer, foundations align north-south with a precision that hints at a known frame of the sky. A mason chalks a line, checks with a cord, twists it twice, and the wall finds true. He doesn't test 10 ways, he performs a remembered act. He doesn't need the reason under the rule to follow it, yet the rule survives intact. The inheritance model also explains the uniformity that stretches across cities. A bushel here weighs what a bushel there weighs. A brick from Ur fits cleanly into a wall in Uruk Canal gates, open with familiar locks. If trade alone created that order, we would expect drift and local quirks to linger. Instead, we find discipline. It's the difference between a recipe you invent and a recipe you're sworn to keep, because the last kitchen burned down. You don't riff, you guard. There's a human cost in that kind of restart. After a world-ending event, survivors would prize reliability over novelty. A scribe copying a star table may know the symbols, but not the full chain of reasoning behind them. He preserves what he can pronounce. A temple singer recites measurements for a boat that can ride out black water, never having seen the sky tear open. The words remain, anchored by ritual, because ritual resists decay. It's a conservative impulse born from trauma. Keep the forms alive so the world will hold. Supporters of the hypothesis point to how memory hides inside ceremony. A purification rite looks poetic until you note the order of washings, mirrors steps in a lab protocol. A creation hymn sounds like theatre until you notice it encodes a sequence. Mixing, ferment, sealed vessels, a waiting period, a final unveiling. Critics counter that rituals always develop structure, and that we read too much into patterns we want to see. Still, the match between procedure and prayer appears too often to pass as coincidence alone. There's also the matter of speed. Within a few centuries, Sumer shifts from scattered settlements to a network of cities with linked economies and legal frameworks. Roads carry cart ruts of matching width. Seals from distant towns reference the same calendar cycles. Agricultural texts treat crop rotation and soil salinity as managed variables. You can get there by slow tuning over generations, but Sumer's timeline looks compressed, as if a teacher moved through classrooms repeating a standard course. A restart also explains the holes. Systems appear whole, but when you press on certain edges, they blur. Some astronomical notes in early lists point to skies out of phase, with the era that wrote them. A law code anticipates a kind of dispute that the local economy would not yet produce. A dictionary preserves words for tools that have no archaeological trace on site. It's the profile of hand-me-down knowledge, where the outline outlives the original context and waits for the world to catch up again. Now, widen beyond Mesopotamia. Far upriver, terrace farming appears with stonework that locks like carpentry. Across the Gulf, copper purity exceeds what a simple furnace should manage. In the highlands to the west, a stone disk tracks seasons with holes that still count light. These echoes do not prove a single parent culture, but they support a picture of survivors fanning out with fragments. Each place rebuilds apart. If the same packets reach Sumer in fuller form, it would explain the density of systems that arrive there at once. Consider how a blueprint behaves after a disaster. You don't rebuild the entire city from memory on day one. You start with water and storage, then measures and records. Then a rule set to settle arguments so the grain doesn't spill to knives. Only then do you raise monuments that double as instruments, placing them on old alignments that steady the eye, the sequence in Sumer, the irrigation texts, the ledgers, the law codes, the temple observatories, follows that practical arc. It is the logic of a field manual, not the drift of an invention culture. There's also the quiet question of authorship. If Sumer copied, who wrote the originals? The names in tablets point backward to beings remembered as great ones, teachers, rulers before the flood. For our purposes, set aside names and look at function. You have an upstream source, a library state, a place where sky time and city time merged into a single clock. That centre doesn't have to be a vast empire. It could be a ring of refugees that shared standards and kept them alive while the lowlands drowned. In that light, Sumer's gods become roles more than deities, offices more than faces. The patron of waters guards the canal plans. The lawgiver stands over the code vault. The messenger holds the calendar. When cities trade in symbols like these, they exchange domains of competence, not just trade goods. A newly rising place that gains the seal of skywatching gains credibility to fix taxes, to harvest cycles, and build trust that the year will turn. It's practical magic, the kind that keeps a city fed. One more street-level moment. A boy carries a basket of marked tablets up ziggurat steps worn to a smooth slope. He switches the bundle from one shoulder to the other. At the top, he hands them to a woman with ink-dark fingertips who checks the marks against a board. She nods, slides them into a shelf and scratches a small tally. They are not writing poems tonight. They are moving a memory bank higher than floodwater. The act is simple. The aim is survival. Over time, any restart risks calcifying into orthodoxy. When you inherit, you protect. Protection can turn to fear of change. So we see bursts of novelty framed as recoveries rather than inventions, like claiming you restored the true measure rather than admitting you created a new one. This posture disperses blame if it fails and borrows authority if it works. It keeps the lineage intact, a practical choice in a world where memory is policy. Does the inheritance hypothesis solve every puzzle? No, it raises new ones. Why do some sequences look older than their layers? Why do certain skills vanish between cities that otherwise match? Why do we find tools that speak to capacity, but not the workshop that should sit behind them? The gaps may be the shadows of triage. If you only have hands to save 10 things, you choose water, food, measure, record, rule, sky, metal, brick, boat, story. Some crafts fall off the raft. The story bends again at those first legal codes. They arrive not as philosophical musings, but as case decisions fixed to fines, weights, and oaths. They tie morality to measure. That's a restart mindset. A law is a tool for keeping a rebuilt system stable when memory still aches. If we inherit that habit from a city that lived through collapse, our own trust in contracts, ledgers, and calendars carries a faint tremor of that older fear and that older care. The city settles into night. Oil lamps burn a little low. The kiln cools. Somewhere a canal gate creaks and closes. A clerk stacks tablets by the door, running a thumb over the edge of one as if checking for chips. It's the small acts that keep a world together after it snaps. If Sumer stands at the point where human beings first gathered the courage to run the program again, then the clay underfoot holds not only the record of what they built, but how they remembered. And in the layers below this city, the ground keeps a different ledger, one that hints at the place where those instructions were first written, waiting for a later dawn to read them. The pattern tilts in the light, and its meaning sharpens. Maybe history's clock wasn't broken. Maybe it was wound after a long dark pause, and Sumer heard it tick first. That first click. Wet clay. Oil smoke. A reed stylus scratching. Sounds small. It echoes far. Consider the cost of a restart. Fields replanted on unknown silt. Star paths relearned by night from rooftops and riverbanks. Law lists drawn to keep grain fair and tempers cooled. If the blueprint came from elsewhere, bundled in crates, sung in rites, or scored into tablets, then the genius is not only in invention but in careful recovery. Some whisper that's why the stories lean so hard on keeping, guarding, sealing. Others dismiss the idea and prefer a slow rise. The truth, perhaps, sits with the hands that did the work. You, right now, are part of that chain, listening in a quiet room while the world moves outside your window. If this story stirs you, leave a trace. Tell us where you're listening from tonight. Name the fragment you'd guard for the next restart. One skill, one song, one line of math, one way to make heat without burning the house. It's one thing to keep a secret. It's another to choose which seed to carry. We'll leave the ziggurats to their moths and the river to its slow bend. Keep your mind open, your skepticism close. Let doubt do its good work, and let wonder keep you curious enough to check the footnotes, to ask for sources, to follow the odd shard that doesn't fit the box it was placed in. Watch the sand. Wind moves, dunes shift, and old rooms breathe when the day cools. Secrets do not stay buried forever.